The rugged laptop screen flashes a violent, blood-red warning. A piercing digital alarm shrieks through the cavernous warehouse, echoing off the rusted steel vats. It's a Trojan, a decoy, the technician screams, knocking his metal chair over in sheer panic. Doctor. Elias Thorne's sophisticated, aristocratic mask shatters into pure, unhinged fury. He draws a heavy pistol, aiming it directly at Clara's chest. "You stupid, arrogant bitch," he roars, spittle flying from his lips. Clara ignores the weapon. Her face is pale, smeared with soot and her own blood, but her eyes blaze with a fierce, desperate maternal fire. "Run, Lily, run," she screams, lunging toward her terrified 7-year-old niece trembling on a rusted crate. She doesn't make it 2 steps. Marcus intercepts her, his massive hand wrapping like a vice around her throat. He slams her brutally onto the cracked concrete, pressing the cold steel barrel of a suppressed handgun directly against her temple. Julian Sterling is paralyzed and bleeding out in his penthouse. Marcus sneers, a sociopathic smirk curling his lips as Clara chokes for air. "He's not coming to save you, Clara." "You lost," Clara gasps, her vision darkening at the edges. But her bloody fingers desperately clutched the cell phone hidden in her pocket, where a metronome app is silently screaming an SOS at 150 beats per minute. How did a fiercely ethical trauma nurse end up caught in a deadly war, trading a mafia boss's empire for the life of a child? Hit that subscribe button and dive into a pulse-pounding story of betrayal, survival, and a love that defies the darkest corners of the underworld. The rain over the city of Hadley did not fall in gentle sheets. It drove down like a calculated assault, washing the grit of the neon-soaked pavement into swirling black eddies along the gutters. Clara Vance walked with her head down, the collar of her thin trench coat turned up against a wind that sliced straight to the bone. In one hand, she clutched a small plastic suitcase containing a few changes of clothes for her 7-year-old niece. Lily, in her other hand, she gripped the strap of her mother's worn leather medical bag, like a lifeline. Inside that bag was a stethoscope, a few rolls of sterile gauze, and a folded piece of paper, a termination notice from Mercy Hospital, whose ink had barely dried before she was escorted out of the building by security. 3 weeks ago, Clara had been one of the most brilliant trauma nurses in the state. A woman who could read a patient's crashing vitals faster than any monitoring machine. But she had made one fatal mistake. She had possessed a conscience. When she discovered that Dr. Elias Thorne, the highly revered hospital board director, was deliberately running unapproved drug trials on the unidentified, impoverished patients who came through the clinic doors, she didn't look the way. A homeless man had died on her shift because of an intentional lethal overdose of an unlisted synthetic opioid. When Clara threatened to bring the records to the federal authorities, Thorne didn't just fire her. He destroyed her. Within 48 hours, she was blacklisted from every medical facility on the East Coast. Her bank accounts were frozen under a fraudulent embezzlement claim, and an anonymous tip to Child Protective Services gave her an ultimatum: find a permanent, verifiable residence within 48 hours, or Lily would be placed into the foster care system. Now, standing on the edge of the industrial district with the rain soaking through her shoes, Clara felt the cold weight of absolute despair. She had nothing left but her dignity, and in Hadley, dignity couldn't buy a loaf of bread, let alone a safe place for her niece to sleep. Lily was currently huddled at a 24-hour diner down the street under the watchful eye of an old friend. But time was ticking away. Clara had 48 hours to perform a miracle, and the clock was already at 36. A sharp, metallic crack shattered the rhythm of the storm. It was a sound Clara recognized instantly from her years in the trauma bay, the unmistakable report of a small-caliber handgun, followed by the wet, heavy thud of a body colliding with the asphalt. Her survival instinct screamed at her to turn around and run back toward the safety of the diner's neon lights. But her medical instinct, the deeply ingrained reflex forged through a decade of saving lives, pulled her feet forward. She ducked into the shadows of a narrow, unlit alleyway between two towering brick warehouses. Through the veil of heavy rain, she saw three figures. Two stood over a third man who was collapsed on his knees, his hands pressed against his abdomen. Thorne said to make it look like a street robbery. Sterling, one of the standing men, barked, his voice muffled by the downpour. He raised a silencer-equipped pistol, aiming it directly at the kneeling man's head. The man on his knees, Julian Jude Sterling, didn't beg, even soaked in blood and rainwater. His broad shoulders remained square, his chin lifted in defiant arrogance. He made a desperate, agonizing attempt to reach into his coat for his own weapon, but his fingers slipped, his strength entirely spent. Before the thug could pull the trigger, Clara acted. She didn't scream or panic. She stepped out of the deep shadows of the warehouse awning, her footsteps silent against the rushing water. Before Jude could even register her presence, Clara's hand clamped firmly over the barrel of Jude's rising gun, forcefully pressing it down toward the pavement. She stood directly between the dying mafia boss and the assassin's barrel, her frame shielding the wounded man entirely. The two thugs froze, startled by the sudden apparition of a woman in a soaked trench coat. The man with the gun sneered, his eyes narrowing. "Get out of the way. Lady, if you don't want a bullet in your chest, too. This ain't your business." Clara didn't blink. Her gaze was as cold and unyielding as the surgical steel she used every day. She stared the armed man dead in the eye, her voice cutting through the thunder with an eerie, detached calm. "Scram before I call the cops instead of an ambulance. By the time you aim that thing at me." The silent alarm I tripped at the warehouse entrance will have the precinct cars blocking both ends of this block. You have about 40 seconds to vanish before you spend the rest of your life in a state penitentiary. It was a blatant bluff, delivered with such icy precision that the thugs hesitated. They looked at each other, then down at Jude, who was losing consciousness rapidly, and finally back at Clara's unflinching expression. In the criminal underworld, hesitation was fatal. Deciding that the boss was already as good as dead from his abdominal wound, the lead thug cursed, lowered his weapon, and gestured to his partner. They spun on their heels, sprinting out of the opposite end of the alley and vanishing into the rainy dark. The moment they were gone, Jude collapsed backward against the brick wall, a harsh, ragged gasp escaping his pale lips. Clara immediately dropped to her knees beside him, her hands moving with lightning speed. She tore open his expensive tailored coat, revealing a dark, blooming crimson stain on the left side of his abdomen. The bullet had missed the abdominal aorta, but had likely clipped the spleen. His skin was turning a dangerous shade of ash gray, and his pulse beneath his jaw was weak, thready, and dangerously fast. Classic shock-induced tachycardia. "Don't touch me," Jude growled, his voice a gravelly whisper. He tried to push her away with a hand slick with his own blood, his eyes wide with a manic, paranoid glare. His chest was heaving in short, hyperventilating bursts. He wasn't just dying of blood loss. He was having a massive PTSD-induced panic attack. "Shut up," Clara said calmly, ignoring his weak resistance as she ripped open a package of sterile trauma dressing from her bag. "You're bleeding out, and your heart is beating at roughly 160 beats per minute. If you keep thrashing, you'll empty your circulatory system onto this pavement in less than 3 minutes." She pressed the thick pad firmly against the wound, leaning her full body weight into it to apply pressure. Jude groaned, his head snapping back against the brick as pain lanced through him. His fingers clawed at the wet asphalt, his breathing becoming even more erratic, his eyes darting around the dark alley as if the ghosts of his past were closing in on him. Clara realized that stopping the bleeding wouldn't matter if his heart gave out from the sheer panic tearing through his nervous system. She reached into her pocket with one hand, pulling out her phone. With a flick of her thumb, She opened a medical metronome app, a tool her mother had taught her to use to pace her own breathing during chaotic field procedures. She set the digital dial to a steady, rhythmic, slow 60 beats per minute. Tick, 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 tick. The crisp, mechanical sound echoed softly under the warehouse awning, cutting through the chaotic roar of the storm. "Look at me," Clara commanded, her voice dropping to a low, authoritative register that she used for hysterical patients in the trauma bay. "Ignore the rain. Ignore the pain. Just listen to the sound. Breathe in on the first tick. Hold it, breathe out on the third. Follow my lead." Jude's frantic gaze locked onto her face. In the dim light of the distant street lamp, her eyes were the only steady thing in his fracturing universe. He heard the slow, persistent sound of the metronome for 3 long years, since the night his younger brother Daniel had died in his arms while his own pulse raced in terror. Jude had been trapped in a perpetual waking nightmare, unable to find a single moment of quiet in his own mind. But this woman's voice, combined with that steady, unwavering rhythm, began to act like an anchor, pulling him out of a stormy sea. Slowly his chest stopped heaving. His breathing began to match the deliberate pace of the app. The sheer terror in his eyes receded, replaced by a deep, intense curiosity as he stared at the destitute woman who was currently saving his life without a hint of fear. "Who are you?" Jude rasped, his vision blurring at the edges as the blood loss took its toll. "A nurse who doesn't like to see people die on her watch," Clara replied, her hands working methodically to wrap a pressure bandage tightly around his torso. "Basic human rights dictate that everyone deserves medical care, no matter their sins. And looking at you, you have plenty of them." Jude let out a weak, bitter chuckle that turned into a grimace. He looked at her worn leather bag, her soaked shoes, and the desperate hunger hidden behind her sharp eyes. He was a master of reading people. He knew a desperate soul when he saw one. Yet she hadn't reached for his wallet or his expensive gold watch. She had only reached for his pulse. "I haven't slept in 3 long years," Jude whispered, his eyelids growing heavy as his body demanded rest. He reached out with a trembling, bloody hand, his fingers locking around the cuff of her wet trench coat with surprising intensity. "The dark, it never stops screaming. But your sound, it makes it quiet." Clara watched him, her brow furrowing. "You need a hospital, mister. No hospitals. Thorne owns the doctors, he'll have me finished," Jude managed to say, his grip tightening on her sleeve. He looked at her with a raw, naked desperation that no one in the underworld had ever seen from Julian Sterling. "I have a private clinic, a safe house. Take me there. Sit beside me tonight. Just sit there. Let me hear that ticking. Keep the dark away until the sun comes up. I'll pay you any price you want. A house, money, protection, name it." The word price echoed in Clara's mind. She thought of Lily sitting in the diner, of the CPS worker waiting to tear her family apart in less than 2 days of Dr. Thorne's arrogant smile as he ruined her life. Here was a man offering her a blank check. A man who clearly had the power to protect her from the very monster who had cast her into the rain. She looked down at the metronome app, still ticking faithfully at 60 beats per minute on the asphalt. Then she looked at the bleeding mafia boss. "Deal," Clara said, her voice steady and resolute. She gathered her medical bag, pulled his heavy arm over her shoulders, and hauled him to his feet, completely unaware of the dangerous, gilded cage she had just volunteered to enter. The private safe house was not a cabin in the woods or a hidden basement. It was a sprawling, hyper-secure penthouse perched atop the highest luxury residential tower in Hadley's financial district. When the private elevator doors slid open, Claire was greeted not by the warmth of a home, but by the cold, sterile grandeur of a modern fortress. The floors were polished dark marble. The walls were reinforced concrete and ballistic glass, and every corner was monitored by state-of-the-art security cameras. There were no photographs on the mantel, no personal trinkets, no signs of a life actually being lived. It was a monument to wealth and profound isolation. By the time they arrived, Jude's private security detail, led by a massive, silent man named Bruno, had already cleared the penthouse's integrated surgical suite. Clara spent the next 3 hours operating on Jude under the high-intensity medical lamps, with Bruno acting as a silent assistant. She cleaned the wound, extracted the bullet fragments that had lodged near his ribs, and closed the lacerated muscle tissue with meticulous, perfect sutures. Her hands never shook. The trauma bay had trained her for worse. But doing it on the city's most notorious syndicate boss, while his heavily armed guards watched her every movement, added an oppressive layer of tension to the room. When the final knot was tied and Jude was moved to the massive, king-sized bed in the master suite, the first light of dawn was beginning to paint the Hadley skyline in shades of bruised purple. Lily had been brought over by Bruno hours earlier and was now asleep in a luxurious guest room down the hall, guarded by 2 men who looked like they could crush a car with their bare hands. Clara stood by the window of the master bedroom, her body aching with the exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical weight. She had changed out of her soaked clothes into a pair of oversized, dark gray sweatpants and a black t-shirt that Bruno had provided, undoubtedly belonging to Jude. The fabric smelled faintly of expensive cedarwood and expensive tobacco, wrapping her in his presence, even though he was currently unconscious on the bed. The digital metronome app on her phone was sitting on the nightstand, its low, rhythmic tick, tick, tick filling the silence of the massive room. Jude stirred on the bed. A low groan escaped him as his eyes fluttered open. The harsh, defensive glare that usually defined his features was absent, replaced by the hazy confusion of a man waking from a deep, dreamless sleep. He looked around the room, his hand immediately flying to his waist, searching for the firearm that wasn't there. "Relax," Clara said softly, stepping away from the window. "You're in your penthouse. The bullet is out. The internal bleeding has stopped, and your vitals are completely stable. Try to move, and you'll rip 24 silk sutures out of your oblique muscles." Jude's gaze snapped to her. He took in her appearance, the oversized clothes that hung loosely on her frame, the dark circles under her sharp eyes, and the calm, authoritative posture she maintained despite being surrounded by killers. His eyes slid to the nightstand, where the metronome was still pacing the silence. "How long was I out?" he asked, his voice incredibly rough. 4 hours, Clara replied, walking over to check his IV line. "And according to your guard, Bruno, that's 4 hours longer than you've slept consecutively in 36 months. "You're welcome." Jude leaned back against the pillows, a strange, complex expression crossing his face. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't wake up screaming. He didn't wake up with his heart trying to burst through his ribs, soaked in a cold sweat of guilt over his brother's death. The silence in his head was intoxicating, and he knew exactly who was responsible for it. "You stayed," Jude murmured, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the air in the room feel suddenly thick, almost suffocating. "I don't break my contracts," Clara said, keeping her tone strictly professional as she reached out to check the dressing on his side. "You promised to pay any price, and I have a niece to protect. I'm holding up my end of the bargain." As her fingers brushed against the bare skin of his abdomen to inspect the bandage, a powerful wave of tension rippled through the space between them. Jude's body went completely rigid, not from pain, but from the sudden, electrifying proximity. Clara froze, her hand resting just above his hip. At this distance, she could see the faint, jagged silver scars that crisscrossed his chest, marks of a life lived in a violent crucible. She could feel the intense, radiant heat of his skin and the rapid rise and fall of his chest. His dark eyes were fixed entirely on her lips, his breath warm against her cheek. The boundary between nurse and patient felt dangerously thin, stretched to its absolute limit. Clara deliberately cleared her throat and stepped back, breaking the spell. She pulled her hands into the pockets of the oversized sweatpants. "I need to discuss something with you regarding your household, Mr. Sterling." Jude swallowed hard, his jaw clenching as he forced his composure back into place. Speak. While I was preparing your post-op antibiotics, I watched one of your lieutenants, the younger one with the slicked back hair, berate one of the kitchen maids because his coffee wasn't hot enough. He threatened to throw her off the service balcony. Clara said, her voice hardening with absolute conviction. I don't care what kind of criminal empire you run out there, Mr. Sterling, but inside this space, while I am treating you, every single human being will be treated with dignity and equality. A maid, a nurse, an elite guard, every life holds the exact same weight. If your men cannot respect basic human dignity, I will take Lily and walk out that door. And you can find another way to quiet your demons. Jude stared at her, genuinely stunned. For years, people had approached him with nothing but absolute terror or calculated flattery. No one dared to lecture him on human rights or workplace equality in his own sanctuary. Yet here was this penniless, blacklisted nurse, standing in his clothes, dictating terms with the authority of a queen. A slow, genuine smile tugged at the corner of his lips, a rare sight that completely transformed his harsh face into something devastatingly handsome. His name is Marcus, Jude said softly. And if he or anyone else breathes a word of disrespect to you or the staff again, Bruno will throw him off the balcony himself. You have my word, Clara. Hearing him say her first name caused a strange, unfamiliar flutter in her chest. She masked it with a curt nod. Good. I'm going to check on Lily. Over the next 2 days, the penthouse settled into an intense, hyper-focused routine. Clara barely left Jude's side, managing his pain, monitoring his healing, and resetting the metronome app every evening. A profound, slow-burn intimacy began to develop between them, built not on words, but on small, heavy microactions. Jude was a man hyper-aware of threats, but Clara noticed that his defensive instincts had shifted. On the second afternoon, a sudden security alert flashed red across the master bedroom monitoring screens, a false alarm caused by a rogue drone near the building's perimeter. Before the guards could even enter the room, Jude, despite his agonizing injury, threw his body out of bed and pinned Clara directly beneath him on the floor, using his massive, muscular frame as a human shield to protect her from the ballistic glass windows. They lay there for several long seconds, the weight of his body pressing her into the deep pile carpet. Clara could feel the heavy, erratic thud of his heart against her ribs, the scent of cedarwood enveloping her entirely. His eyes searched her face for any sign of injury, his hands gripping her shoulders with a protective fierceness that felt entirely real. When Bruno announced via the intercom that the perimeter was clear, Jude slowly rolled off her, a dark flush creeping up his neck as he muttered a quiet apology. Clara's heart was hammering, not from the security alert, but from the terrifying realization that she was starting to feel safe in the arms of a monster. By the evening of the third day, Jude's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. He was able to sit up in his private study, reviewing financial documents while Clara organized his medical charts at the adjacent desk. The air between them was quiet, comfortable, and laced with a domesticity that felt entirely alien to the cold penthouse. At 9 p.m., Jude was called away to the secure communications room by Bruno to handle an urgent territorial dispute in the docks. I'll be 20 minutes, Jude said, pausing at the doorway. He looked back at Clara, his eyes softening. Make yourself at home. Once he was gone, the silence of the study closed in on Clara. She stood up to stretch her aching muscles, her gaze wandering over the rows of pristine, unread leather-bound books on the shelves. As she walked past his heavy mahogany desk, her elbow accidentally caught the edge of a thick, unmarked manila folder that had been left near the paperweight. The folder tumbled to the floor, its contents spilling across the dark marble. Clara dropped to her knees to gather the papers, but her hands froze mid-air. Her breath caught violently in her throat, the blood completely draining from her face until her lips turned numb. Staring up at her from the floor were high-resolution surveillance photographs of a luxury vehicle, a private estate, and a detailed map of a daily route. Attached to the top sheet was a headshot of a distinguished, older man with an arrogant, polished smile, the face that had haunted her nightmares every night since she was ruined. It was Dr. Elias Thorne. But it wasn't just a biographical file. Across the front of Thorne's face, written in Jude's sharp, decisive handwriting with a red marker, was a single, chilling word. To terminate, Clara sat on the floor, the cold marble seeping through her clothes, clutching the papers in trembling hands. The illusion of her safe, quiet sanctuary shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She wasn't just a nurse treating a wealthy patient. She was living in the heart of a bloody war. And the man who held her future in his hands was a professional executioner targeting the very monster she had fled. The heavy oak door of the study began to click open. Clara looked up, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, as Jude Sterling stepped back into the room. The heavy oak door of the study clicked shut with a sound that felt as final as a judge's gavel. Clara remained frozen on the cold marble floor, the manila folder resting heavily in her trembling hands. The surveillance photographs of Dr. Elias Thorne seemed to mock her from the polished stone. His arrogant smile a stark contrast to the violently scribbled red word commanding his termination. When Clara finally managed to drag her gaze upward, she found Julian Sterling standing just inside the threshold. He had discarded his suit jacket, his dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the edge of the pristine white bandages she had applied just days ago. The air in the room instantly dropped in temperature. Jude did not shout. He did not rush forward to snatch the classified documents from her grasp. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his dark eyes locking onto hers with the predatory calculation of a man assessing a sudden, unexpected threat in his most private sanctuary. For several agonizing seconds, neither of them breathed. The only sound in the cavernous study was the distant, muffled roar of the city traffic far below the reinforced glass. Clara's mind raced frantically, trying to reconcile the vulnerable, broken man she had saved in the alleyway with the cold-blooded executioner standing before her. She had known he was a criminal, a syndicate boss who operated in the violent shadows of Hadley. But seeing the physical proof of an assassination order, and seeing that it was aimed at the very man who had destroyed her life, sent a shockwave of profound dissonance through her system. Slowly, Jude stepped forward, his movements deliberate and silent. He reached down, his large hand gently closing over her trembling fingers, and pulled the photographs from her grip. He didn't look at the face of his target. He only looked at Clara, his expression an impenetrable mask of hardened stone. "You were looking for a book," Jude said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that offered no apology and no explanation. It was a statement of fact, a quiet acknowledgement that she had not been deliberately spying on his operations. Clara swallowed the dry lump in her throat, forcing herself to stand up. She refused to cower. She was a trauma nurse. She had stood her ground against screaming addicts, arrogant surgeons, and the creeping shadow of death itself. She would not let this man intimidate her, even in his own fortress. "I knocked the folder off the desk by accident," Clara replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the violent hammering of her pulse. She pointed a shaking finger at the photograph in Jude's hand. "Why do you have a termination order on Dr. Elias Thorne? He is the board director of Mercy Hospital. He is a prominent physician. What possible reason could a man like you have to order a hit on a doctor?" Jude's jaw clenched, a muscle feathering rapidly beneath his scarred cheek. He tossed the folder carelessly onto the mahogany desk, as if the life of Elias Thorne meant absolutely nothing to him. "Thorne is not a doctor," Clara, Jude said softly, the quiet intensity of his tone far more terrifying than a shout. "He wears a white coat and sits on a hospital board. Yes, but that is nothing more than a carefully constructed, legitimate facade. Elias Thorne is the architect of the largest illicit synthetic opioid distribution network on the eastern seaboard. He uses his position at Mercy Hospital to launder his drug money, to silence whistleblowers, and to access unrestricted chemical precursors. He is a poisoner disguised as a healer." The words hit Clara with the physical force of a physical blow. The breath rushed out of her lungs as they scattered. Jagged pieces of her own nightmare suddenly slammed into perfect, horrifying alignment. She stumbled back a half step, her hand coming up to cover her mouth. The homeless patient who had crashed on her shift, the man who had died in agony while she desperately pumped his chest, had not been the victim of a simple medical error. He had not been part of an unapproved, rogue clinical trial to cure a disease. He had been a human guinea pig for a drug cartel. Thorne had been testing the lethal thresholds of a new batch of synthetic opioids on the most vulnerable, invisible members of society, the people no one would look for, the people whose lives the system deemed worthless. Oh my God, Clara whispered, the absolute horror of the realization threatening to buckle her knees. The overdose. The patient who died on my watch. I thought Thorne was just corrupt, cutting corners for pharmaceutical kickbacks. I threatened to report him to the medical board, to the federal regulators. I thought I was fighting a crooked hospital administrator. Jude closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He did not touch her, but his massive frame seemed to shield her from the sudden, crushing weight of the truth. You threatened to expose a cartel kingpin, Clara. You walked into the den of a monster and told him you were going to burn his empire to the ground. It is an absolute miracle he only destroyed your career and froze your bank accounts. Most people who threaten Elias Thorne end up in an oil drum at the bottom of the Hadley River. Jude's eyes darkened, a shadow of profound, unhealed grief passing over his harsh features. My younger brother, Daniel, was an investigative journalist. He was brilliant, idealistic, and stubbornly brave. He found out what Thorne was doing. He traced the supply chains, the phantom shell companies, the blood money washing through the hospital's charity funds. Before he could publish the story, Thorne's men caught him. They didn't just kill him, Clara, they made an example of him. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Clara looked into Jude's eyes and saw the bottomless well of trauma that had kept him awake for 3 years. The panic attacks, the night terrors, the frantic need for the steady, uncompromising rhythm of the metronome. It all stemmed from his failure to protect the person he loved most from the very man who had ruined Clara's life. In that silent, charged moment, the boundaries between their 2 entirely different worlds dissolved. The virtuous, fiercely ethical trauma nurse and the ruthless, violent underworld fixer were no longer standing on opposite sides of morality. They were 2 broken survivors, scarred by the exact same monster, bound together by a shared, desperate need for justice. Clara straightened her spine, the shock receding, replaced by a cold, burning resolve that she had never felt before. He used my emergency room as a testing ground, she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, venomous whisper. He treated human beings people with beating hearts and inherent dignity like disposable laboratory rats. A heartbeat doesn't check a bank account before it stops. Jude, every single life holds the exact same weight. I won't let him get away with it. Jude stared at her, a profound mixture of awe and dangerous possessiveness blazing in his dark eyes. He reached out, his knuckles lightly brushing against her cheek in a gesture so tender it felt entirely foreign to the violent man he was. He won't, Jude vowed, his voice a lethal promise. You are under my protection now. Clara, Thorne will never touch you, and he will never touch Lily. I will tear his empire apart brick by brick, and when there is nothing left but ashes, I will put a bullet between his eyes. But until then, you stay here. You stay safe. The alliance was forged in the quiet darkness of the study, sealed not with a handshake, but with an unspoken, electrifying understanding. For the next 3 days, an illusion of absolute peace descended upon the fortress-like penthouse. It was a false safety, a fragile bubble of domesticity floating above a city preparing for war. But Clara allowed herself to sink into it. The weekend arrived with brilliant, unexpected sunshine pouring through the floor-to-ceiling ballistic glass. For the first time in years, the penthouse felt less like a heavily guarded bunker and more like a home. On Saturday morning, Clara found herself in the massive, state-of-the-art kitchen. her hands dusted with flour as she flipped pancakes on the griddle. Lily, dressed in a pair of bright yellow pajamas, was sitting on the high marble island, swinging her legs and chattering endlessly about a cartoon she had watched the night before. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere that usually followed Jude's security detail had magically evaporated. Bruno, the terrifying head of security, was quietly drinking coffee in the corner, a faint, amused smile on his scarred face as he watched Lily try to balance a strawberry on her nose. When Jude walked into the kitchen, the transformation was staggering. The dark circles under his eyes had faded significantly, a testament to the consecutive nights of deep, metronome and chord sleep he was finally achieving. He was wearing casual gray sweatpants and a fitted black t-shirt that stretched over his muscular frame, his posture relaxed, the hyper-vigilant tension completely absent from his shoulders. He walked straight to the island, effortlessly lifting Lily into the air before setting her down on a stool, much to the little girl's delighted giggles. Clara watched them, her heart performing a dangerous, traitorous flutter in her chest, seeing the ruthless syndicate boss painstakingly cut a pancake into tiny, perfectly even squares for her niece was a sight she could never have predicted. He was gentle, infinitely patient, and fiercely protective. The terrifying monster the city whispered about did not exist in this room. There was only a man who had been starved of light for so long that he was now entirely captivated by it. Over the weekend, the slow-burn tension between Clara and Jude deepened into a heavy, intoxicating gravity. They didn't speak of Thorn, of the impending violence, or of the underworld. They spent the evenings sitting on the massive leather sofa in the living room, reading in comfortable silence while Lily slept down the hall. Occasionally, their knees would brush, or their fingers would linger when passing a cup of tea. Every accidental contact sent a jolt of electricity straight to Clara's core. She was falling in love with a man she was supposed to fear, a man whose hands were stained with blood, but whose heart beat with a fierce, unwavering loyalty that she had never experienced in her life. She felt profoundly, undeniably safe. She truly believed that within the reinforced walls of the penthouse, guarded by Jude's army, the nightmares of her past could never reach them. But the devil does not always kick down the front door. Sometimes, he is invited inside by a trusted friend. Monday afternoon arrived, casting long, melancholic shadows over the city streets. Clara had decided to pick Lily up from her elite, highly secure private school herself, escorted by two of Jude's men. It was a small gesture of normalcy, a desire to feel like a regular aunt waiting at the school gates. The armored SUV pulled up to the pristine brick building of the academy. Clara stepped out, the crisp autumn air filling her lungs, a dense, genuine smile playing on her lips as she walked toward the main entrance. The school courtyard was bustling with children in neat uniforms, their laughter echoing off the masonry. Clara approached the front desk, offering a warm greeting to Mrs. Gable, the elderly headmistress who always waited with the younger students. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Gable. I'm here for Lily Vance." The headmistress looked up, adjusting her silver-rimmed glasses, a pleasant, confused smile wrinkling her features. "Oh, Miss Vance, good afternoon. But you just missed her. She left about 20 minutes ago." Clara's smile froze, a strange, cold prickle of unease started at the base of her spine and rapidly crawled up her neck. "Left? What do you mean she left? I didn't authorize anyone else to pick her up. She is only supposed to be released to me or Bruno. It wasn't a stranger, dear," Mrs. Gable said reassuringly, pulling out the digital sign-out tablet to show her the screen. "It was the other gentleman from your private security detail. The polite younger man with the slicked-back hair. Marcus, I believe his name is." He showed his identification, and Lily seemed perfectly happy to see him. She said he was taking her to get ice cream before going back to the penthouse. The world abruptly stopped spinning. The ambient noise of the laughing children, the rustling autumn leaves, and the distant traffic completely vanished, replaced by a high-pitched, deafening ringing in Clara's ears. Marcus, Jude's right-hand man, the lieutenant who had threatened the maid, Marcus never did school runs. Marcus was supposed to be managing the port logistics today. Marcus was Jude's most trusted inner circle. The air was suddenly sucked from Clara's lungs. The illusion of her golden cage shattered, the jagged shards raining down to slice her heart to ribbons. She wasn't safe. She had never been safe. The sickness of the underworld had already infected the fortress. And her precious, innocent niece was trapped in its jaws. As Clara stood paralyzed in the school lobby, the color completely draining from her face, her cell phone vibrated violently in the pocket of her trench coat. The caller ID was a blocked number, with a hand trembling so violently she could barely hold the device. She swiped the screen and lifted it to her ear. "Hello, Clara," the smooth, cultured, and terrifyingly familiar voice of Dr. Elias Thorne echoed through the speaker. "I believe it is time we discuss the price of your continued defiance." The voice of Dr. Elias Thorne dripping from the phone speaker was like liquid nitrogen poured directly into Clara's veins. Every muscle in her body locked into a rigid, paralyzed state of sheer terror. She stood in the immaculate lobby of the academy, surrounded by oblivious parents and cheerful children, while her entire universe collapsed into a terrifying abyss. The walls seemed to tilt inward, threatening to crush her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. She could only listen to the smooth, aristocratic cadence of the monster who had stolen her child. "Marcus is a very ambitious young man," Thorne continued, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather over afternoon tea. "Julian Sterling pays well, but Julian demands absolute loyalty and adherence to a rather tedious moral code. I, on the other hand, offer unrestricted power and a much higher dividend." Marcus recognized the shifting tides of the city's power structure months ago. "He has been quite useful in keeping me informed of Mr. Sterling's vulnerabilities. And it seems, my dear Clara, that you and your charming little niece have become his greatest vulnerability of all. If you touch a single hair on her head," Clara hissed, her voice a ragged, guttural whisper that tore at her throat. The fierce, protective maternal instinct roaring to life inside her temporarily overrode the paralyzing panic. "If you hurt her, Thorne, I swear to God you will do exactly as I instruct." "Clara," Thorne interrupted, his voice snapping like a frozen twig, dropping the polite facade to reveal the absolute cruelty beneath. "Right now, Lily is enjoying a very expensive strawberry sundae in the back of an armored vehicle heading toward an undisclosed location. She is unharmed, and she believes this is a surprise field trip. I am a businessman. Clara, I do not deal in unnecessary bloodshed when a simple transaction will suffice. But make no mistake, if you attempt to warn Julian, if you signal Bruno, or if you call the police, Marcus has standing orders to put a bullet in the child's head and dump her body in the harbor. Do you understand the terms of our arrangement?" Tears of sheer, desperate helplessness burned Clara's eyes. She closed her eyes tightly, a single sob escaping her lips. "Yes, I understand. What do you want?" "Julian keeps an encrypted, biometric hard drive, a silver ledger locked in the hidden wall safe behind the primary bookshelf in his private study. It contains the routing numbers, offshore accounts, and the entire financial infrastructure of his syndicate. Without it, he is paralyzed. With it, I can dismantle his operations overnight," Thorne explained coldly. "Marcus observed Julian opening the safe last week. The biometric lock requires Julian's fingerprint, but the secondary manual override code is your birth date. How remarkably sentimental of him. I want that ledger. Clara, you will return to the penthouse, retrieve it, and bring it to the abandoned chemical refinery on the edge of the industrial district by midnight. If you deliver the ledger, you get the girl. If you fail, or if you bring Julian's army with you, you will never see her again." The line went dead with a hollow click. Clara lowered the phone, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the device on the marble floor. She was completely trapped. Thorne had engineered an impossible, devastating ultimatum. He had weaponized his love freely to force her into betraying the man she was falling in love with. If she went to Jude and told him the truth, a massive, bloody war would instantly erupt. Jude would tear the city apart to find Lily, but Thorne was a cornered rat. The moment he sensed Julian's forces moving, he would have Marcus execute Lily to tie up loose ends. A frontal assault was suicide for her niece. But to steal the ledger was to commit the ultimate act of betrayal. It would strip Jude of his empire, his resources, and his ability to protect himself. She would be handing the man who had saved her over to a monster, destroying him utterly. Clara walked out of the school and climbed into the back of Jude's armored SUV. The two loyal guards in the front seat, oblivious to the fact that their comrade had just kidnapped her niece, asked if everything was all right. Clara forced a wooden nod, blaming a sudden migraine. As the vehicle navigated the darkening streets of Hadley, Clara's mind transitioned from blind panic to a cold, clinical, and desperate calculation. She was a trauma nurse. She was trained to operate under catastrophic pressure, to make life or death decisions when the monitors were screaming and the blood was flowing. She refused to be a passive victim. She refused to let Thorne dictate who lived and who died. She could not simply weep and blindly betray Jude. She knew that even if she handed over the real ledger, Thorne had no intention of letting her or Lily live. They were loose ends, witnesses to his crimes. Giving him the real ledger was essentially signing Jude's death warrant and guaranteeing her own execution. She had to outsmart them. She had to give Jude a chance to strike back without triggering Marcus's execution order. By the time the elevator doors opened into the penthouse, Clara's face was an emotionless mask, burying the screaming agony in her heart beneath a veneer of professional composure. She walked into the living room and felt a sickening jolt in her stomach. Marcus was standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, casually sipping a glass of bourbon. He looked perfectly relaxed, acting exactly as a loyal lieutenant should. When he saw Clara, a faint, mocking smile tugged at the corner of his lips. It was a silent, arrogant confirmation that he held all the cards. "Evening, Clara," Marcus said smoothly. "School pickup go well." Clara wanted to scream. She wanted to lunge across the room and claw his eyes out. Instead, she forced her hands into her coat pockets, her fingernails biting deep into her own palms to ground herself in the physical pain. "Fine, Marcus. Thank you." She walked past him without breaking stride, heading straight for the master's suite. She had 4 hours until midnight. She had to execute the most dangerous, heartbreaking procedure of her life. At 10 o'clock, Jude was sitting behind the mahogany desk in his private study, reviewing a stack of shipping manifests. The heavy oak door clicked open, and Clara stepped inside, holding 2 heavy crystal tumblers filled with amber whiskey. She had changed into a simple black dress, her hair pulled back, her face pale but resolute. The air in the room instantly thickened, the slow-burn sexual tension that had been building between them over the past week, immediately saturating the space. Jude looked up, the harsh lines of his face instantly softening at the sight of her. He pushed the documents aside, his dark eyes tracking her every movement as she approached the desk. "I thought you were asleep," Jude said softly, his voice a low rumble that sent a tremor straight to her core. "I couldn't sleep," Clara replied, setting 1 tumbler down in front of him. "I thought you might need a break." Jude leaned back in his leather chair, his gaze lingering on her lips before rising to meet her eyes. He reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently brushing against her wrist as he took the glass. The contact was electric, a searing reminder of the profound safety she felt when he touched her. "Where is Lily?" he asked, taking a sip of the bourbon. "She's already asleep," Clara lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Every instinct in her body screamed to throw herself into his arms, to confess everything, to beg for his help. But the image of Marcus's mocking smile and Thorne's chilling threat held her tongue hostage. She had to play the long game, even if it broke her own heart. Clara watched him drink. She had used her medical access to Jude's private clinic downstairs to acquire a powerful, fast-acting but non-lethal sedative. She had laced his whiskey with just enough of the chemical to knock him unconscious for approximately 3 hours, enough time for her to make the exchange and execute her plan. You look tense, Jude noted, his brow furrowing slightly as a wave of unexpected lethargy began to wash over him. He blinked, shaking his slightly as if trying to clear a sudden fog. Is everything all right, Clara? Everything is going to be fine. Jude, Clara whispered, stepping around the desk to stand directly beside him. She reached out, running her fingers gently through his dark hair, offering him a final moment of comfort before she shattered his trust. Jude tried to stand to pull her into his arms, but his muscles suddenly refused to obey. His legs felt like lead, his vision blurring rapidly as the sedative seized control of his nervous system. He looked up at her, the confusion in his dark eyes rapidly transforming into a heartbreaking, devastating realization. The woman who had saved him. The woman who had anchored him in the dark. The woman he was ready to give his entire empire to had just poisoned him. Clara, Jude rasped, his voice betraying a profound, shattering agony that had nothing to do with physical pain. He tried to reach for his weapon, a desperate, fading instinct, but his arm collapsed heavily onto the desk. Why? Tears finally spilled over Clara's eyelashes, tracking silently down her pale cheeks. She didn't offer excuses. She couldn't risk Marcus having bugged the room. She leaned down, pressing a desperate, lingering kiss against his forehead as his eyes finally fluttered shut, surrendering to the chemical darkness. I'm so sorry, she whispered to his unconscious form. But I have to save her, and I have to save you. Clara moved with the clinical precision of a surgeon. She stepped behind the massive bookshelf, dragging her fingers along the wooden paneling until she found the hidden seam. She punched her birth date into the concealed keypad. The wall clicked softly, sliding open to reveal a reinforced steel safe. Inside sat the silver, encrypted ledger. She took the real ledger out, but she did not put it in her pocket. Instead, she opened her medical bag, pulled out a heavy roll of surgical tape, and secured the real drive tightly to the underside of the bottom drawer of Jude's desk. A place Thorne's men would never think to look if they raided the penthouse later. She then reached into her bag and retrieved a nearly identical silver USB drive she had found in the clinic's administrative office, using Jude's laptop, which was still logged into his administrative account. Clara rapidly copied a hidden, aggressive GPS tracking malware onto the decoy drive. It was a sophisticated Trojan virus Jude's cybersecurity team had developed to track rival cartels. The moment Thorne plugged that decoy drive into his secure network to access the funds, the malware would silently broadcast his exact coordinates and map his entire digital infrastructure directly to Jude's servers. But a decoy drive wouldn't be enough. She needed Jude to wake up and understand exactly what was happening. She needed him to know she hadn't abandoned him to his enemies. She needed to send an SOS that only he would understand. Clara walked back to Jude's unconscious body. She carefully unbuttoned his shirt, exposing his broad chest and the healing surgical scars. She took her cell phone out of her pocket and opened the metronome app, the very sound that had tethered his soul to hers, the rhythm that had banished his night terrors. She placed the phone directly over his heart, but she didn't set the dial to a calm, steady 60 beats per minute. With a trembling finger, she dragged the digital slider all the way up to a frantic, screaming 150 beats per minute. Tick, 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 tick. It was a chaotic, machine gun rhythm. In the medical field, a heart rate of 150 BPM was the universal code for ventricular tachycardia. It was the siren song of a crashing patient. It was an absolute, catastrophic emergency. It was her desperate, silent scream for help. Clara looked at the man she loved one last time. The erratic, frantic ticking of the phone echoing violently in the quiet study. She turned on her heel, picked up the decoy ledger, and walked out the door. She passed Marcus in the hallway, ignoring his smug expression, and headed straight for the elevator. She was walking into the lion's den alone, armed with nothing but her intellect and a desperate hope that the mafia boss she had just drugged would wake up in time to read her pulse. The drive to the abandoned chemical refinery felt like a descent into the underworld itself. The city of Hadley faded away in the rearview mirror, its glittering skyline replaced by a desolate, decaying industrial wasteland. Skeletal remains of rusted cranes clawed at the starless night sky, while hollowed-out concrete silos loomed like silent tombstones in the freezing rain. Clara's hands gripped the steering wheel of the unassuming sedan she had taken from the penthouse garage so tightly that her knuckles were entirely bloodless. Her heart hammered against her ribs in a frantic, sickening cadence, a physical manifestation of the sheer terror threatening to consume her. She had spent a decade in the emergency room staring death in the face, calculating dosages and compressing chests while patients bled out on the linoleum tiles. But this was different. This was not a stranger's life slipping through her fingers. This was Lily, the innocent, bright-eyed little girl who had given Clara a reason to survive the darkest chapters of her own life, was currently in the hands of a monster who viewed human beings as disposable commodities. Clara pulled the vehicle to a halt outside a massive, corrugated iron structure that had once served as the main processing plant for the refinery. The heavy chain-link gates had been forced open, their rusted hinges groaning in the wind. A single high-powered halogen work light spilled a harsh, blinding beam across the cracked concrete of the loading dock. There were two heavily armored black SUVs parked near the entrance, their engines idling with a low, menacing purr. Clara turned off the ignition, plunging the interior of her car into darkness. She took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the clinical, detached persona of a trauma nurse to the forefront of her mind. She could not afford to tremble. She could not afford to weep. She reached into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold metal casing of the decoy USB drive. It was a silver cylinder, identical in weight and design to Julian Sterling's actual financial ledger. Loaded within its memory banks was a highly aggressive, self-executing malware designed to broadcast the exact coordinates of whatever network it was plugged into. It was a desperate, suicidal gamble, but it was the only play she had. Stepping out into the freezing rain, Clara walked toward the cavernous maw of the refinery. The interior was vast and echoing, smelling strongly of old sulfur, damp concrete, and rotting machinery. Puddles of oily black water reflected the sparse, flickering emergency lights strung along the rusted catwalks above. Standing in the center of the massive room, surrounded by 6 heavily armed mercenaries, was Dr. Elias Thorne. He looked entirely out of place in the industrial decay, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit covered by a pristine cashmere overcoat. Holding a sleek black umbrella to shield himself from the water dripping through the compromised roof, to his right stood Marcus, Jude's treacherous lieutenant, his slicked-back hair catching the dim light, a sickeningly arrogant smirk plastered across his face. And there, sitting on a rusted metal crate between them, was Lily, Auntie Clara. Lily cried out, her small voice echoing off the cavernous walls. Her eyes were wide with confusion and fear, her small hands clutching a half-eaten cup of strawberry ice cream that Marcus had undoubtedly bought to keep her docile during the abduction. She swung her legs, trying to hop down from the crate, but Marcus's large hand clamped down hard on her small shoulder, forcing her to stay seated. Let her go. Thorne, Clara demanded, her voice ringing out with a fierce, uncompromising authority that momentarily surprised the mercenaries in the room. She kept her posture straight, refusing to show them the paralyzing fear that was currently liquefying her insides. I am here. You have what you want from me. Let the child walk out that door right now, and we can conclude this transaction. Thorne chuckled, a dry, aristocratic sound that lacked any genuine warmth. He closed his umbrella and handed it to one of his guards, stepping forward into the pool of light. You have always possessed a rather tedious flair for the dramatic. Clara, it is the very trait that made you such an annoyance at Mercy Hospital. You could never simply look the other way, could you? You always had to play the righteous savior. He gestured lazily with his leather-gloved hand. The ledger. Toss it over. Once my technical associate verifies the encryption signature and confirms that Julian's offshore accounts are accessible, The girl is free to go. I am a man of my word. Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver drive. She held it up, letting the dim light catch its metallic surface. She leaves first, Clara countered, her eyes narrowing. I give you the drive. You put it in your laptop, and the moment it verifies. Lily gets in my car. If you try to change the terms, I will smash this drive beneath my heel right now. I know you need the physical hardware to bypass Jude's biometric firewall. Without this drive, you get absolutely nothing. Thorne's polite smile vanished, replaced by a cold, reptilian calculation. He stared at Clara, assessing her determination. He knew she was a desperate animal backed into a corner, and desperate animals were entirely capable of self-sabotage. He offered a slight nod to Marcus. Very well. Bring the laptop. Let us indulge the nurse's maternal instincts. Marcus snapped his fingers, and one of the mercenaries stepped forward, opening a rugged, military-grade laptop on a nearby oil drum. The screen glowed to life, casting a sickly blue pallor over Thorne's face. Clara walked forward slowly, every muscle coiled tight as a spring. She kept her eyes locked on Lily, offering the terrified little girl a reassuring, albeit strained, smile when she reached the oil drum. Clara placed the silver drive onto the rusted metal surface. She stepped back instantly, her hands raised, creating distance between herself and the armed men. Thorne picked up the drive, inspecting the heavy casing with a look of profound satisfaction. Julian Sterling's entire empire, reduced to a single piece of hardware, he murmured. He built a kingdom of blood and fear, and yet he was undone by a pair of pretty eyes and a bleeding heart. How remarkably poetic. Thorne handed the drive to the technician. Plug it in. Run the decryption bypass Marcus provided. I want to see those account balances. The technician inserted the drive into the USB port. Clara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her sternum. She needed the malware to deploy silently. She needed it to ping Jude's servers without raising any immediate alarms on Thorne's end, buying her just enough time to grab Lily and run. The technician's fingers flew across the keyboard, lines of code reflecting in his dark eyes. For 5 agonizing seconds, nothing happened, and then the laptop screen violently flashed red. A loud, piercing digital alarm shrieked from the laptop's speakers. A massive warning window popped up on the screen, displaying a scrolling wall of aggressive, executing code that was actively locking down the computer's operating system and establishing a forced uplink. The technician scrambled backward, knocking his folding chair over in sheer panic. Sir, it's a trap. The drive is a Trojan. It's executing a forced geolocation ping and locking me out of the mainframe. It's a decoy. Thorne's head snapped toward Clara, his eyes wide with a sudden, unrestrained fury. The mask of the sophisticated hospital director completely shattered, revealing the vicious, bloodthirsty cartel boss beneath. You stupid, arrogant bitch. Thorne roared, his voice echoing like thunder in the warehouse. Run, Lily. Run to the car, Clara screamed, lunging forward to grab her niece. She didn't make it 2 steps. Marcus intercepted her with brutal, calculated efficiency. His large fist slammed directly into Clara's stomach, driving the air from her lungs with a sickening thud. Clara collapsed to the cold concrete, gasping frantically for oxygen that refused to enter her paralyzed diaphragm. Before she could recover, Marcus grabbed a handful of her dark hair, yanking her head back with enough force to nearly snap her neck, and slammed her face first into the unforgiving concrete. Pain exploded behind Clara's eyes in a blinding flash of white light. She tasted copper and ash as her lips split open. The world spun violently around her, the ambient sounds of the warehouse warping into a distant, muffled underwater echo. Grab the kid, Marcus barked to the mercenaries, ignoring Lily's terrified, ear-piercing screams as a massive guard scooped the kicking, thrashing child off the floor. Clara tried to push herself up, her medical instincts screaming at her to assess her own injuries, to fight through the concussion. But her body betrayed her. She was a nurse, a healer, a woman who understood the intricate mechanics of the human body. But against the sheer, overwhelming brute force of trained killers, Her intellect was completely useless. Marcus kicked her viciously in the ribs, a sharp crack echoing through the space as bone gave way. Clara curled into a fetal position, weeping not from the agonizing physical pain, but from the absolute, soul-crushing despair of failure. She had tried to outsmart the devil, and she had lost everything. She was going to die on this filthy floor, and Lily was going to be thrown into the harbor, millions of miles away, in the pristine, silent sanctuary of the penthouse. Julian Sterling was drowning in a chemical fog. The sedative Clara had slipped into his bourbon was a highly refined, surgical-grade benzodiazepine derivative. It was designed to paralyze the motor functions and plunge the brain into an inescapable, dreamless void. But Clara had underestimated three things: Julian Sterling's immense physical mass, his unnaturally high tolerance for narcotics built up over years of surviving the underworld, and the sheer, indomitable force of his willpower. Jude's consciousness clawed its way back from the abyss, swimming upward through a thick, suffocating darkness. His eyelids felt like they were sewn shut with lead wire. His limbs were heavy, disconnected, refusing to respond to the frantic electrical signals his brain was sending, but his hearing the primal, hyper-vigilant sense that had kept him alive in the dark for so long was the first thing to return. Tick, 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 tick. It was a chaotic, rapid-fire sound. It was not the slow, rhythmic 60 beats per minute that had coaxed him into a peaceful slumber over the past week. It was a frantic, screaming machine gun cadence pressing directly against his chest, with a monumental, agonizing effort that caused a cold sweat to break out across his forehead. Jude forced his eyes open. The world was a blurry, spinning kaleidoscope of shadows and dim light. He was lying on the floor of his study. He dragged his heavy, uncoordinated hand up to his chest, his fingers closing around the cold rectangular shape of Clara's cell phone. He brought the screen close to his face, squinting through the chemical haze. The metronome app was open. The digital dial cranked all the way to 150 BPM. Jude's tactical mind, though sluggish, began to process the information. Clara had drugged him. Clara had left him. But why leave her phone? Why leave the one tool that had anchored him, set to a rhythm of absolute panic? In the medical world, a heart rate of 150 was a crisis. It was an emergency code. She hadn't just abandoned him. She had left a desperate, screaming SOS. Adrenaline, the body's ultimate. Primal override surged into Jude's bloodstream, violently burning through the remaining sedative. He rolled onto his side, gritting his teeth as the newly healed surgical wound in his abdomen screamed in protest. He forced himself onto his hands and knees, dragging his body across the floor toward his mahogany desk. He pulled himself up, leaning heavily against the wood, his chest heaving as he fought the lingering vertigo. He looked at the bookshelf. The hidden safe was wide open. The silver ledger was gone. A wave of betrayal briefly threatened to consume him. But the frantic ticking of the phone in his hand anchored his logic. If she wanted to betray him, she would have taken the phone. She would have let him sleep. She wouldn't have set an alarm. Jude's hand scrambled over the desk, pulling open drawers, searching for any other clue. His fingers brushed against the underside of the bottom drawer, feeling the thick, unnatural texture of surgical tape. He ripped it away, his breath catching in his throat. The real, encrypted silver ledger fell into his palm. Jude stared at the drive, the absolute truth crashing over him with the force of a tidal wave. She hadn't betrayed him. She had protected his empire, protected his life, and walked into a suicide mission armed with nothing but a decoy to save whatever Thorne had threatened. And Jude knew exactly what Thorne had threatened: the child, Lily. The lingering lethargy of the drug evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold, terrifying, and absolute rage. The man who had spent the last week cutting pancakes into squares and reading quietly on a sofa vanished. The apex predator of Hadley's underworld returned, his eyes burning with a murderous, unholy fire. Jude slammed his fist into the emergency intercom button on his desk. "Bruno," he roared. his voice shaking the heavy oak doors of the study. Less than 5 seconds later, the study doors burst open. Bruno and 3 heavily armed guards rushed into the room, their weapons drawn, expecting an assassination squad. Instead, they found their boss standing behind his desk, strapping a tactical Kevlar vest over his dress shirt and racking the slide of a matte black heavy-caliber handgun. "Sir, you were unresponsive," Bruno began, his eyes wide. "Where is Marcus?" Jude demanded, his voice a lethal, vibrating growl that made even his most hardened killers flinch. Bruno hesitated, confusion crossing his scarred face. "Marcus took a perimeter rotation 2 hours ago. He isn't responding to radio checks. Miss Vance and the child are also missing from the residential wing." Jude threw the decoy tracker tablet across the desk to his head of security. The screen was flashing with a bright red geolocation pin, transmitting a steady signal from an abandoned chemical refinery in the industrial district. "Marcus is a dead man," Jude stated, his tone devoid of any human emotion. "Thorn has them. Mobilize every single strike team we have in the city. Tell them to converge on those coordinates. I don't care about stealth. And I don't care about the police." Jude walked past Bruno, checking the spare magazines on his tactical belt. "Find her," he commanded, his eyes completely black with righteous fury. "Find her and burn everything they love to the ground." The cold, unforgiving concrete of the warehouse floor offered Clara no mercy as she fought to remain conscious. Her vision was swimming in a dark, terrifying tunnel, the sharp pain in her fractured ribs flaring like a hot knife with every shallow, ragged breath she took. She could taste the coppery tang of her own blood pooling in the corner of her mouth, mixing with the grit and dust of the industrial decay. Above her, the atmosphere in the refinery had descended into absolute, violent chaos. The discovery of the decoy drive had not only enraged Dr. Elias Thorne, it had triggered a catastrophic breakdown in the fragile alliance between the hospital director and the traitorous lieutenant. "You promised me Julian's offshore accounts, Marcus," Thorne screamed, spittle flying from his lips as he aggressively advanced on Jude's former right-hand man. The sophisticated facade of the doctor was entirely gone. "This was a trap. The network is compromised. Sterling's cyber team is probably triangulating this exact location right now. You assured me this nurse was a weak, easily manipulated pawn." Marcus did not cower. Instead, he let out a cold, humorless laugh, his hand slowly drifting toward the heavy pistol holstered at his hip. "She was your loose end. Thorne, you underestimated her. Not me, and frankly, the offshore accounts were just a bonus. The real objective was getting Julian out of his fortress, so he could be eliminated in the open. But since the money is gone, and Sterling is likely on his way here with a heavily armed strike team, our partnership is no longer mutually beneficial." Before Thorne could even register the threat, Marcus drew his weapon with blinding speed. He didn't aim at the doctor. He aimed at the 2 mercenaries flanking Thorne. 2 suppressed shots rang out in rapid succession, dropping the guards to the floor with lethal precision. The remaining mercenaries, suddenly realizing that Marcus was staging a violent coup to seize Thorne's illicit empire for himself, raised their rifles. The warehouse erupted into a deafening, chaotic firefight. Tracer sunsand zipped through the dark, cavernous space, ricocheting off rusted steel beams and showering the concrete with brilliant, deadly sparks. "Kill him," Thorne shrieked, diving behind a massive, rusted chemical vat for cover as Marcus's bullets tore through the metal plating inches from his head. Marcus fell back behind the heavy steel pillars of the loading dock, returning fire with lethal accuracy. He knew he couldn't win a prolonged gunfight against Thorne's remaining muscle, especially with Jude's army likely closing in. He needed a distraction, and he needed to completely erase the evidence of his betrayal. His eyes darted to the massive, pressurized gas lines running along the lower walls of the refinery remnants of the plant's operational days that were still heavily laden with highly flammable chemical residue. With a chilling, sociopathic smirk, Marcus aimed his weapon at the main pressure valve and fired 3 consecutive rounds. The metal ruptured with a catastrophic, high-pitched hiss. A thick, white cloud of highly volatile chemical vapor rapidly flooded the lower level of the warehouse. A split second later, a stray spark from a ricocheting bullet ignited the gas. The explosion was a concussive, devastating force of nature. A massive fireball bloomed in the center of the refinery. An inferno of orange and blue plasma that violently blew the rusted metal roof panels straight into the night sky. The shockwave threw mercenaries through the air like broken ragdolls, shattering the remaining glass windows and sending a rain of deadly shrapnel raining down across the concrete floor. Clara, lying only 30 feet from the epicenter of the blast, saw the fireball expanding toward her in terrifying slow motion. Adrenaline, fueled by the purest, most desperate maternal instinct, violently overrode the agonizing pain in her fractured ribs and the fog of her concussion. She didn't think. She merely reacted. She scrambled across the concrete on her hands and knees, ignoring the jagged glass tearing through her sweatpants. She reached Lily just as the shockwave hit, throwing her own body completely over the terrified little girl, using her back and shoulders as a human shield against the searing heat and flying debris. The roar of the explosion was deafening, followed immediately by the terrifying, crackling roar of a massive structural fire. The rusted vats and chemical lines began to burn with a fierce, toxic intensity, instantly filling the cavernous warehouse with thick, choking acrid black smoke. Auntie Clara, it hurts. I can't breathe. Lily sobbed, her small hands clutching desperately at Clara's torn shirt. I know, baby. I know. Keep your face down. Breathe into your shirt. Clara coughed, her own nose burning as the toxic smoke began to displace the oxygen in the room. She forced herself to look up, her eyes watering profusely. The warehouse was a hellscape. Bodies of mercenaries lay motionless in the growing flames. Thorne and Marcus were nowhere to be seen, having likely retreated deeper into the labyrinth of the refinery to escape the inferno and each other. Clara knew that if they stayed on the floor, the smoke inhalation would kill them in less than 3 minutes. She had to get Lily out. Fighting through a wave of nauseating dizziness, Clara pulled Lily to her feet. Hold my hand. Lily, do not let go. No matter what happens, we have to stay low and move toward the draft. What followed was a terrifying, cinematic cat-and-mouse sequence through the burning ruins of the industrial plant. The heat was oppressive, singing the hair on Clara's arms and making the air shimmer with violent distortion. Clara kept her body hunched over Lily, moving from the cover of one rusted concrete pillar to the next. The sounds of secondary explosions echoed from the upper catwalks as neglected chemical drums ruptured under the extreme heat. Through the thick, swirling black smoke, Clara could hear the frantic, angry shouting of Thorne's surviving men, blindly searching the perimeter for Marcus, or for her. Check the loading bays. Don't let the woman escape. A voice roared through the smoke, followed by the terrifying sweep of a high-powered tactical flashlight, cutting through the haze just a few yards away. Clara clamped her bloodied hand tightly over Lily's mouth, dragging the child behind the heavy steel tread of an abandoned forklift. She held her breath, her heart hammering so violently against her fractured ribs that she thought she might pass out from the pain. The heavy boots of a mercenary crunched over broken glass, stopping just inches from the forklift. Clara closed her eyes, preparing to launch herself at the man with her bare hands to give Lily a chance to run. But then, a new sound cut through the roar of the flames. It was a sound Clara had heard 1,000 times during her shifts at the trauma center, a sound that universally signaled salvation and rescue. The high-pitched, piercing wail of police sirens. Red and blue emergency lights violently strobed through the shattered windows of the refinery, casting erratic, frantic shadows across the smoke-filled room. The heavy tires of police cruisers screeched against the wet pavement outside, and the authoritative blare of a megaphone echoed over the chaos. Hadley Police Department. Drop your weapons and step out of the building with your hands raised. The mercenary near the forklift cursed violently, instantly abandoning his search to sprint toward the rear exit to avoid arrest. Clara sagged against the metal of the forklift, a massive, overwhelming wave of relief crashing over her. Tears of sheer gratitude streamed down her soot-stained face, cutting clean tracks through the dirt and blood. They were saved. The nightmare was over. The police had arrived, likely tipped off by the explosion, and they were going to get Lily out of this hell. "Come on, Lily," Clara gasped, pulling the coughing child to her feet. "The police are here. We're safe. We're going to be safe." Clara stumbled out from behind the forklift, raising her hands high above her head to show she was unarmed. Dragging Lily toward the massive loading bay doors, where the strobing blue and red lights promised sanctuary. As she emerged from the thick smoke into the rain-slicked courtyard, the cold night air hit her lungs like a physical blow. There were 3 police cruisers parked in a defensive semicircle, their spotlights blindingly bright. Uniformed officers were advancing with weapons drawn, securing the perimeter. A tall, broad-shouldered police captain in a dark rain slicker jogged toward Clara, his flashlight sweeping over her battered, bleeding face and the terrified child clinging to her leg. He lowered his weapon instantly, his expression shifting to one of deep, professional concern. "Ma'am, are you injured? We got calls about the explosion," the captain said urgently, reaching out to support Clara as she nearly collapsed into his arms. "Paramedics are 2 minutes out. Let's get you and the little girl away from the structure before the roof caves in. Thank you," Clara sobbed, her clinical detachment finally shattering entirely. "Dr. Elias Thorne, he's inside. He kidnapped my niece. He's running a cartel. You have to arrest him. We'll handle it. Ma'am, you're safe now," the captain said soothingly. He placed a strong, reassuring hand on Clara's shoulder, guiding her toward the back of the nearest cruiser. He opened the rear door, gesturing for her to get in. "Just sit in the back. Keep warm. I'll have an officer bring the child to the paramedic unit in the second car." "No," Clara said instinctively, her grip on Lily's hand tightening. "She stays with me. We don't separate." The captain smiled, a warm, fatherly expression that was designed to disarm and comfort traumatized victims. "It's standard protocol. Ma'am, we need to check her for smoke inhalation in the specialized pediatric unit in car 2. You'll be right next to each other, I promise." Clara hesitated. The exhaustion was pulling her down into a dark abyss, her fractured ribs screaming for relief. The captain seemed so genuine, so professional. She nodded slowly, loosening her grip on Lily's hand. Okay. Just please be gentle with her. Always," the captain said, as he reached forward to take Lily's hand. The sleeve of his heavy rain slicker rode up slightly, exposing the thick, pale skin of his inner wrist. The strobing red and blue lights of the cruiser illuminated the area for a fraction of a second, but it was long enough for Clara's trained, observant eyes to lock onto it. It was a tattoo, a very specific, highly detailed tattoo of a coiled serpent wrapped around a medical caduceus. It was the exact same tattoo Clara had seen on the neck of the mercenary who had held the laptop inside the warehouse. It was the mark of Elias Thorne's syndicate. The psychological whiplash was absolute and devastating. The profound relief Clara had felt just seconds ago violently inverted, turning into a horror so deep and paralyzing it stopped her breath. The police hadn't arrived to save them. The police were on Thorne's payroll. This wasn't a rescue. It was a cleanup operation. Thorne had summoned his corrupt officers to extract him from Marcus's coup, and they were quietly taking Clara and Lily away to be executed far from the public eye. "No," Clara screamed, her voice tearing through her damaged throat. She lunged forward, trying to grab Lily back, trying to push the captain away. "Lily, run. They aren't cops. Run," but Clara was injured, exhausted, and completely overpowered. The fatherly smile on the captain's face instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, sociopathic sneer. He didn't say a word. He merely drove the butt of his heavy flashlight directly into Clara's stomach, hitting the exact spot Marcus had bruised earlier. Clara collapsed to the wet pavement. gasping for air and agonizing, silent heaves. Before she could recover, two officers grabbed her by the arms, hauling her violently off the ground. They shoved her brutally into the back of the first cruiser, the heavy reinforced door slamming shut and locking with a hollow, finalized clack. Clara scrambled desperately against the thick plexiglass divider, her bloody hands leaving smeared, desperate handprints on the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, she watched in absolute, soul-crushing despair as the captain effortlessly scooped up a screaming, kicking Lily. He didn't carry her to a paramedic unit. He carried her to the third cruiser, throwing the tiny child into the back seat and slamming the door. The cruiser immediately shifted into gear, its tires spinning on the wet asphalt as it sped away into the dark, rainy night, taking the only light in Clara's life away from her. Clara screamed, a raw primal sound of pure agony that tore from the very depths of her soul. Bouncing uselessly off the soundproof glass of the police car, she beat her fists against the window until her knuckles bled, watching the taillights of Lily's car vanish into the storm. She was trapped in the back of a corrupt police cruiser, bleeding, broken, and entirely powerless. Dr. Elias Thorne had won. The devil had manipulated the game, corrupted the very institutions designed to protect the innocent, and crushed her entirely. As the cruiser carrying Clara shifted into drive, heading toward a dark, remote execution site, Clara sank back against the hard plastic seat, weeping in absolute, total despair, believing that the golden cage she had left behind in the penthouse was the last time she would ever feel safe. The interior of the corrupt police cruiser smelled of stale coffee, cheap vinyl, and the sharp, metallic tang of Clara's own blood. She lay slumped against the reinforced plexiglass divider, her hands bound behind her back with heavy plastic zip ties that bit mercilessly into her wrists with every jolt of the vehicle. Rain lashed against the darkened windows in violent, diagonal sheets, obscuring the decaying industrial district as the car sped further away from the city's grid. Up front, the police captain and his partner sat in relaxed silence, the radio occasionally crackling with dispatch codes they entirely ignored. The captain caught Clara's eye in the rearview mirror, his lips curling into a sociopathic, satisfied smirk. He reached forward and turned up the heater, adjusting his collar, where the edge of the syndicate's serpent tattoo peeked out from beneath the fabric. He was completely at ease. A predator calmly transporting his prey to a slaughterhouse, perfectly hidden by the badge on his chest. Clara closed her eyes. The agonizing, sharp pain of her fractured ribs making every breath a monumental struggle. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the catastrophic, suffocating void opening in her chest. Lily was gone. The only pure, innocent light in Clara's universe had been stolen, ripped from her arms and thrown into a separate vehicle moving toward an unknown, terrifying fate. She had failed. She had tried to outsmart a monster, and she had dragged her niece directly into the depths of hell. As the cruiser accelerated down a desolate, unlit stretch of access road bordered by abandoned shipping containers, Clara allowed the tears to fall. They were hot, silent streaks of absolute defeat. She thought of Julian Sterling, lying paralyzed and drugged on the floor of his study. She wondered if he would ever wake up, if he would ever understand that her betrayal was a desperate illusion meant to protect him. The metronome she had left beating a frantic warning over his heart felt like a naive, foolish prayer now. She was going to die in the dark, and Julian would never know the truth. The captain reached for the radio. Unit 4. This is Unit 1. We are 3 miles out from the disposal site. Confirm visual on the secondary package. Static crackled over the speaker, followed by a voice Clara recognized as one of the fake officers who had taken Lily. Unit 1, we have visual. The child is secure in the back seat. We are right behind you. The voice was abruptly, violently severed. Clara did not hear the impact before she felt it. The physics of the collision defied the limits of human perception. A massive, matte black, armor-plated SUV traveling at an excess of 80 miles per hour with its headlights completely blacked out to bone the police cruiser with the catastrophic, deafening force of a freight train. The sound of rending metal, shattering glass, and exploding airbags merged into a single, terrifying sonic boom. The world instantly inverted. The heavy police cruiser was lifted entirely off the wet asphalt, spinning violently through the air like a discarded toy. Clara was thrown brutally against the reinforced ceiling, then the doors, her bound hands offering zero protection as gravity violently reasserted itself. The cruiser slammed back down onto the road, rolling twice before finally coming to a halt on its crushed roof, sliding 50 feet in a shower of brilliant orange sparks. Silence, heavy and ringing, descended upon the wreckage. Clara hung upside down, suspended by the seatbelt cutting fiercely into her collarbone. Blood dripped from a fresh laceration on her forehead, pooling on the crushed interior roof below her. She was entirely disoriented, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. The front of the cruiser was a compressed nightmare of crumpled steel and deployed airbags. The driver was motionless, his neck bent at an unnatural, fatal angle. The captain, however, was groaning, his hands frantically clawing at his jammed seatbelt as panic finally shattered his arrogant composure. Through the spiderwebbed cracks of the remaining window, Clara saw the storm raging outside, and then, stepping out from the shadows of the massive, idling SUV, a figure emerged. He moved with the terrifying, predatory grace of an apex predator. Rain slicked his dark hair flat against his forehead, and his tailored dress shirt was soaked. Clinging to the tactical Kevlar vest strapped tightly across his broad chest. In his right hand, he held a heavy caliber handgun, its barrel completely steady despite the chaotic storm. It was Julian Sterling. He had not succumbed to the darkness. He had read her pulse, deciphered her desperate SOS, and he had come to tear the world apart to find her. Jude did not hesitate. He walked directly to the overturned cruiser, his dark eyes burning with an unholy, murderous fire that could have melted the twisted steel. He raised his heavy boot and kicked the shattered remnants of the driver's side window inward, reaching his massive, scarred hand through the jagged glass. He grabbed the corrupt police captain by the tactical collar of his uniform, with a roar of pure, adrenaline-fueled rage. Jude ripped the man entirely out of the crushed vehicle, hauling him through the window frame like a rag doll. He threw the captain onto the wet pavement, pressing the heavy steel barrel of his handgun directly between the corrupt officer's eyes. "Where is she?" Jude's voice was not a shout. It was a lethal, vibrating frequency that seemed to shake the very asphalt beneath them. The captain coughed up a mixture of rainwater and blood, his hands raised in sheer, unadulterated terror. The badge on his chest meant absolutely nothing to the monster standing over him. "In the back. She's in the back. Sterling, I swear to God, she's alive." Jude didn't even blink. His finger tightened on the trigger, fully intending to erase the man from existence for daring to lay a hand on Clara. "Jude, stop." The voice was weak, ragged, and trembling, but it sliced through the storm with the precision of a scalpel. Jude's head snapped toward the cruiser. Clara had managed to writhe her way out of the shattered back window, her bound hands awkwardly dragging her battered body onto the wet road. She was covered in soot, rain, and blood, her breath coming in agonizing gasps as her fractured ribs ground together. Jude's entire demeanor shifted the moment he saw her. The murderous demon vanished, instantly replaced by the fiercely protective man who had carefully cut Lily's pancakes into tiny squares. He holstered his weapon, dropping to his knees beside Clara. He pulled a combat knife from his tactical belt and sliced through the thick plastic zip ties binding her wrists. His hands, the same hands that had just threatened to execute a man moving with incredible, agonizing gentleness. "I've got you," Jude whispered, his voice cracking as he pulled her trembling, freezing body into his chest, wrapping his heavy tactical jacket around her shoulders. "I've got you, Clara. You're safe." "Lily," Clara sobbed, burying her face against the Kevlar covering his heart, listening to the frantic, powerful thud of his chest. They took Lily in the other car, Thorn. He wants to kill her. She's safe, Jude assured her, his hand burying into her damp hair, holding her against him as if he were trying to physically shield her from the memory of the night. Bruno intercepted the second cruiser a mile back. My men have the child. She doesn't have a scratch on her. Clara, they are bringing her to the penthouse right now. Marcus is dead. The ledger is secure. Thorn's empire is currently being dismantled by my cyber team. It's over. Clara exhaled a breath that felt like it had been trapped in her lungs for a century. The relief was so profound it made her dizzy. She clung to Jude, her fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt as if he were the only solid object in a spinning universe. But as Jude pulled back to inspect the laceration on her forehead, his eyes hardened again. He looked over his shoulder at the corrupt police captain, who was desperately trying to crawl away into the shadows of the shipping containers. Jude stood up in one fluid motion, drawing his weapon once more, the safety clicking off with a loud, metallic snap. He hit you, Jude stated, his voice returning to that cold, dead frequency. He put his hands on you. Jude aimed the weapon, preparing to fire. No, Claire pushed herself up, ignoring the searing pain in her chest, and grabbed Jude's arm. She stepped between him and the cowering captain, her eyes blazing with a fierce, unwavering moral clarity. Put the gun down. Jude, do not pull that trigger. He is Thorn's property. Jude growled, the muscles in his jaw ticking violently. He used the authority of the law to kidnap a child and drag you to an execution site. He doesn't deserve to breathe the same air as you. I don't care what he deserves. Clara shouted over the rain, her hands gripping Jude's forearms tightly. She forced him to look directly into her eyes, refusing to let him sink back into the darkness. We do not become the monsters we are fighting. Julian, we do not execute people in the streets. Justice requires due process, not slaughter. Have some respect for human life, even if it is a life that is fundamentally broken. If you shoot him, you are no better than Thorn. You are just another killer in the dark, and I refuse to love a killer. The word hung in the air, heavy and electrifying, momentarily silencing the roar of the storm. It was the first time she had spoken the truth aloud, the first time she had named the profound, terrifying emotion that had been building between them since the alleyway. Jude stared at her, his chest heaving, the unholy fire in his eyes warring against the pure, undeniable light radiating from hers. For 3 years, his life had been defined by blood for blood, a vicious cycle of vengeance that had only deepened his nightmares. But Clara was offering him a different path. She was demanding that he step into the light, not just for her, but for his own soul. Slowly, agonizingly, Jude lowered the weapon. He engaged the safety and slid the gun back into its holster. He looked down at the captain, his expression one of absolute disgust. My men will bind him. We will hand him, along with all the evidence of Thorn's syndicate, directly to the federal authorities. He will rot in a supermax prison for the rest of his miserable life. Jude turned his back on the captain, returning his entire focus to Clara. Without another word, he scooped her up into his arms, carrying her effortlessly toward his undamaged SUV as his tactical teams arrived to secure the crash site. Clara rested her head against his shoulder, her heart swelling with an overwhelming, profound love. She had not only saved his life, she had saved his humanity. The drive back to the penthouse was a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline withdrawal. When the private elevator doors finally opened, the cold, sterile fortress had never looked more beautiful. Bruno was standing in the foyer, and sitting on the massive leather sofa in the living room, wrapped in a thick cashmere blanket and sipping hot cocoa, was Lily. The little girl looked up, her eyes widening as she saw Jude carrying her aunt. Auntie Clara, Lily cried, dropping the mug and sprinting across the marble floor. Jude set Clara down gently, and she immediately dropped to her knees, ignoring the sharp protest of her ribs, to pull Lily into a fierce, desperate embrace. She buried her face in the child's hair, weeping openly, Thanking every star in the universe that her niece was unharmed. Lily clung to her just as tightly, her small hands wiping away the soot and blood from Clara's cheeks. Jude stood a few feet away, watching the reunion with a heavy, protective gaze. He had built his entire empire to ensure that no one he cared about would ever be taken from him again. And for the first time since his brother died, he felt like he had actually succeeded. An hour later, the chaos had settled. Lily, exhausted from the traumatic evening, was fast asleep in the guest room, heavily guarded by Bruno himself. The penthouse was quiet, the storm outside reduced to a gentle, rhythmic patter against the reinforced glass. Clara sat on the edge of the master bed, having finally washed the blood and dirt from her skin in the massive marble shower. She wore one of Jude's clean white dress shirts, the fabric soft against her bandaged ribs. Jude stepped out of the adjacent bathroom, having also cleaned the grime of the night from his skin. He wore dark sweatpants, his chest bare, the surgical scars Clara had stitched perfectly visible under the warm ambient lighting. He walked over to the nightstand, picking up Clara's cell phone. The metronome app was closed, the frantic 150 BPM alarm finally silenced. Jude sat down beside her on the edge of the mattress. The heavy, oppressive weight of the underworld felt millions of miles away. The silence between them was not tense. It was thick, charged, and overwhelmingly intimate. "You drugged me," Jude murmured, his voice a low, rough vibration that sent a shiver down Clara's spine. He didn't sound angry. He sounded profoundly humbled. "You walked into a chemical plant to face a cartel boss and a traitor, armed with nothing but a decoy drive and a pulse monitor application. You are the most terrifying, brilliant woman I have ever met." Clara looked down at her hands, a faint blush creeping up her neck. "I couldn't let him take Lily. And I couldn't let him destroy you. It was a terrible plan. Jude, I almost died." Jude reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently cupping her jaw, tilting her face up to meet his dark, intense gaze. "But you didn't. You survived. And you brought me back from the edge." Again, his thumb brushed softly across her lower lip. "You said you refused to love a killer. Clara, does that mean, if I choose to be the man you want me to be, if I leave the dark behind, does that mean you could love me?" Clara looked into his eyes, seeing the raw, naked vulnerability of a man offering her his entire soul. The walls she had built to protect herself, the professional boundaries she had sworn to maintain, crumbled into dust. She didn't answer with words. She leaned forward, closing the final inch between them, and pressed her lips softly against his. The kiss began as a gentle, tentative exploration, a desperate seeking of comfort after hours of sheer terror. But the moment Jude's arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, the slow-burn tension that had been simmering between them for days violently ignited. It was a passionate, breathtaking collision of two souls who had finally found their safe harbor. Jude deepened the kiss, his mouth moving over hers with a fierce, possessive hunger, claiming her entirely. Clara tangled her fingers in his dark hair, kissing him back with equal desperation, pouring all her fear, her relief, and her profound, undeniable love into the embrace. They fell back onto the mattress together, entirely lost in each other, believing with every fiber of their being that the war was finally over. They had won. The monsters were locked out, and they were safe. But the devil is a master of patience, and his most lethal strikes are rarely delivered with a gun. In the middle of the profound, passionate silence of the master suite, a terrible, sickening sound echoed from the hallway. It was a heavy thud, followed by the terrifying, ragged sound of someone choking for air. Clara and Jude broke apart instantly, the romantic spell shattering like thin ice. Clara's medical instincts flared, a cold dread instantly pooling in her stomach. She scrambled off the bed, ignoring the screaming pain in her ribs, and sprinted into the hallway. Jude right behind her. Outside the guest room door, Bruno was kneeling on the polished marble floor in a state of absolute, uncharacteristic panic. Lying in the center of the hallway, her small body convulsing violently in a grand mal seizure, was Lily. Lily, Clara screamed, dropping to the floor and immediately sweeping the child's airway. But as Clara tilted Lily's head back, a terrifying sight stopped the blood in her veins, thick, viscous. Completely black blood bubbled from the corners of Lily's mouth, staining the pristine white collar of her pajamas. The child's lips were turning a deep, horrifying shade of cyanotic blue, her skin entirely cold to the touch. The victory they had just celebrated was a poisoned illusion. The nightmare wasn't over. It had merely been waiting for them to let their guard down. The high-tech, subterranean medical clinic located 3 floors beneath Julian Sterling's penthouse was designed to handle catastrophic gunshot wounds, explosive shrapnel, and severe blunt force trauma. It was an illegal, state-of-the-art facility equipped with the finest diagnostic machinery money could buy, staffed by discreet professionals. But as Clara burst through the double doors carrying Lily's convulsing, cyanotic body, the multi-million-dollar room felt entirely useless. The pristine white walls seemed to close in on her, mocking the desperate, suffocating panic clawing at her throat. Get her on the central trauma bay. I need a crash cart, an intubation kit, and a direct line for a massive talk screen right now. Clara roared, her voice tearing through the sterile silence. She laid Lily on the steel examination table, her hands moving with a frantic, hyper-focused speed. Jude followed closely behind her, his face a mask of absolute horror. He had faced heavily armed hit squads without a flinch. But watching the small, innocent child who had baked pancakes with him just a day ago thrash in a violent seizure paralyzed him completely. He stood helplessly against the wall, watching Clara transform back into the fierce trauma nurse who had saved his life in the alleyway. But this time, Clara's hands were shaking. She's hypoxic. Oxygen saturation is dropping rapidly, hovering at 72% and falling. Clara muttered rapidly, attaching sticky electrode pads to Lily's small chest to monitor her erratic, weakening heartbeat. She grabbed a penlight from her pocket and pulled back Lily's eyelids. The pupils were pinpoint small, completely unresponsive to the blinding light. A chilling realization struck Clara like a physical blow. Pinpoint pupils, respiratory depression. This is an opioid overdose. But the presentation is wrong. The onset is too slow. And the black blood indicates severe, rapid tissue necrosis and internal hemorrhaging. Clara spun around, ripping open a drawer on the crash cart. She pulled out a large syringe preloaded with naloxone, the universal, immediate antidote for opioid overdoses. I'm pushing 2 milligrams of Narcan push, she announced to the empty room, her voice trembling as she found a vein in Lily's small, pale arm and injected the life-saving drug. In a standard emergency room, naloxone acts like a miracle. Within seconds, the opioid receptors in the brain are cleared, the patient gasps for air, and the crisis is averted. Clara stared at the digital monitor, her hands gripping the steel edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were white. She counted the seconds in her head, waiting for the jagged, erratic lines of Lily's heart rate to stabilize, waiting for the little girl to take a deep, greedy breath of oxygen. 10 seconds passed. Then 30. Then a full minute. Lily did not wake up. In fact, the seizure intensified, the black blood continuing to bubble past her lips, staining Clara's pristine white shirt as she frantically tried to suction the airway. The heart monitor began to emit a steady, terrifying alarm, indicating that Lily's pulse was rapidly slowing down, marching steadily toward cardiac arrest. Come on, come on, Lily, breathe. Breathe for me, baby, Clara begged, her voice breaking into a ragged sob. She grabbed another syringe of naloxone, pushing a second, massive dose into the IV line, pushing 4 more milligrams. Please, God, let it work. Another minute passed. The monitor's alarm grew more urgent. The naloxone was having absolutely zero effect. The realization hit Clara with a devastating, soul-crushing finality. The 3 despairs of her life: losing her career, handing over the ledger in the warehouse, and watching the corrupt police cruiser drive away, were entirely eclipsed by the absolute magnitude of the helplessness consuming her now. She was a brilliant trauma nurse, She had spent a decade studying pharmacology, anatomy, and emergency protocols. She had saved Jude from a fatal gunshot wound with nothing but a rusty first aid kit and a metronome app. She possessed the knowledge and the power to pull people back from the brink of death. But right now, standing in a multi-million-dollar medical facility, she was entirely, fundamentally powerless. She wasn't dealing with a standard street drug. She was dealing with Elias Thorne's masterpiece, while Lily was held captive. Thorne hadn't just fed her ice cream. He had injected her with an experimental, slow-acting, highly complex synthetic designer opioid. It was a lethal toxin chemically engineered to completely bypass standard counteragents, designed specifically for untraceable assassinations. It was the very drug Thorne had been testing on the homeless at Mercy Hospital, the drug that had killed the man on Clara's shift, the drug with no known public cure. Clara collapsed to her knees on the cold, sterile tiles of the clinic floor. Her medical knowledge, her fierce intellect, her unwavering moral compass, none of it mattered. She was reduced to sobbing, broken mess, her hands entirely covered in her niece's black blood. The identity she had built for herself, the proud savior and healer, disintegrated into ash. She was watching her reason for living slowly die on a steel table, and she could do absolutely nothing to stop it. "Clara," Jude whispered, his voice thick with an agony he had not felt since the night his brother died. He crossed the room and dropped to his knees beside her, pulling her shuddering body into his chest. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her it was going to be okay, because they both knew it wasn't. He just held her, anchoring her as her world violently tore itself apart. The role reversal was absolute. The man she had saved from a panic attack was now the only thing keeping her tethered to reality as she drowned in her own profound despair. "I can't save her." "Jude," Clara wept, her fingers clawing desperately at his shirt. "I can't fix this." He poisoned her with the synthetic strain. Naloxone doesn't bind to the receptors. It's destroying her cellular structure from the inside out. "I'm a nurse. Jude, I'm supposed to save people. And I can't even save my own child. He took my career. He took my dignity. And now he's taking her." He won. Jude held her tighter, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He looked up at the digital monitor, watching the green line of Lily's heartbeat grow weaker and more irregular with every passing second. The monstrous, crushing weight of powerlessness threatened to bury him alongside Clara. He had billions of dollars in offshore accounts. He commanded an army of lethal, highly trained mercenaries. He could influence politicians and judges with a single phone call. But all his money, all his violence, and all his underworld power were entirely useless against the microscopic poison currently destroying the little girl's heart. Suddenly, cutting through the sterile hum of the medical equipment and Clara's desperate sobs, a sharp, electronic buzzing filled the room. It was a burner phone, specifically the one Jude kept in his tactical vest for secure, untraceable communications. Very few people in the world had the number. Jude released Clara gently, his eyes hardening as he pulled the small, black device from his pocket. The screen displayed an encrypted caller ID. He pressed the answer button, raising the phone to his ear. The silence on the other end was heavy, calculated, and dripping with malicious satisfaction. "Julian." Dr. Elias Thorne's aristocratic voice floated through the speaker, crisp and perfectly composed, entirely unaffected by the destruction of his warehouse or the loss of his ledger. "I imagine the atmosphere in your state-of-the-art clinic is quite frantic right now. Is the child cyanotic yet? Has the internal hemorrhaging presented? I must say, the clinical trials on the vagrants were somewhat inconsistent, but I formulated this specific batch to have a delayed, highly aggressive onset. The black blood is a fascinating biological response. Wouldn't you agree?" A murderous, freezing calm washed over Jude. He stood up slowly, stepping away from Clara so she wouldn't hear the monster's voice. "What do you want?" "Thorne, I want what was stolen from me." Thorne replied smoothly. "Your little nurse is quite the clever tactician." The decoy drive was a brilliant maneuver. It cost me my primary manufacturing hub and several loyal employees. But intelligence without leverage is entirely useless. Clara took my empire. So I took the only thing in the world she values. An eye for an eye. Julian, it is the oldest, most fundamental law of our shared world. There is no cure for this synthetic. Jude growled. His eyes locked on the fading heartbeat monitor above Lily's table. My medical team analyzed the chemical structure. It is a closed-loop toxin. You've killed her. Ah, but that is where you are mistaken. Thorne chuckled softly. A good pharmaceutical CEO never releases a poison without quietly manufacturing the antidote. It is the most basic principle of supply and demand. I possess the only synthesized, chemically stable antidote in existence. A single intravenous injection, and the child's receptors will clear in less than 60 seconds. The necrosis will halt, and she will survive. Jude's breath caught in his throat. A tiny, desperate sliver of hope pierced the absolute darkness. Name your price. The ledger, the offshore accounts, my entire syndicate network. Name it, and it is yours. Just give me the antidote. I do not want your money anymore, Julian, Thorne said, his voice dropping the polite facade, revealing a cold, unadulterated hatred. You and Clara have made this entirely personal. You humiliated me. You destroyed my life's work. I do not want your ledger. I want your life. Jude didn't hesitate. Done. Tell me where you are. My main pharmaceutical laboratory. Hidden beneath the abandoned shipyard on the east docks. Thorne instructed. You will come alone. Unarmed. You will walk through the front doors and surrender yourself to my remaining security forces. I will execute you personally, Julian. And, in exchange, I will hand the vial of the antidote to whichever one of your pathetic lackeys is waiting outside the gate. If you attempt a tactical assault, if you bring Bruno, or if you try to outsmart me again, I will smash the vial on the concrete floor. And Clara will get to watch her beloved niece slowly suffocate on her own necrotic blood. You have exactly 30 minutes before the child's cardiac muscle sustains permanent, fatal damage. The clock is ticking, Mr. Sterling. The line went dead. Jude lowered the phone, staring at the blank screen for a long, heavy moment. He had spent his entire life fighting to survive, building an impenetrable fortress around himself so that he would never have to feel the helpless agony of loss again. But looking at Clara, broken and weeping on the floor, and looking at the innocent child dying on the table, Jude finally understood the ultimate truth of the world he lived in. True power was not the ability to take a life. True power was the willingness to sacrifice your own life to save someone you loved. Jude walked back to Clara. He knelt down, taking her blood-stained hands in his, pressing a desperate, reverent kiss against her knuckles. Listen to me, Clara, look at me. Clara lifted her tear-streaked face, her eyes hollow and completely devoid of hope. Thorne has the antidote, Jude said clearly, his voice steady and absolute. He has the only vial. I know where he is. I am going to get it, and I am going to bring it back to you. I promise you, Clara, Lily is not going to die tonight. Clara's medical training fought against the desperate hope his words offered. Jude, it's a trap. Thorne is a psychopath. He won't just hand it over. He wants to kill you. If you go there, he will slaughter you, and he still won't give us the cure. I know, Jude said softly, offering her a faint, heartbreaking smile. But it is a price I am more than willing to pay. Keep her breathing. Clara, intubate her. Run the manual ventilator. Do whatever you have to do to buy her 30 minutes. I will handle the rest. Before Clara could protest, before she could grab his arm and beg him not to throw his life away for a bargain with the devil, Jude stood up and walked out of the medical bay. He didn't put on a Kevlar vest. He didn't rack the slide of his heavy-caliber handgun. He walked into the private elevator entirely unarmed, preparing to walk directly into the jaws of the underworld to purchase a miracle with his own blood. As the elevator doors slid shut, Clara was left alone in the sterile, terrifying room, the sound of the failing heart monitor mocking the fierce, Desperate love that had just doomed the man who had finally brought her peace. The abandoned shipyard on the eastern docks was a graveyard of rusted maritime industry, a labyrinth of decaying dry docks, towering steel cranes, and empty cargo containers stacked like children's building blocks against the stormy night sky. The rain had intensified, washing the smells of salt and old diesel fuel over the cracked concrete. Julian Sterling drove the unmarked SUV through the rusted main gates, the headlights cutting a solitary path through the absolute darkness. He did not bring Bruno. He did not bring a tactical strike team. He wore no Kevlar vest. And his heavy-caliber handgun remained locked in the safe at the penthouse. He was walking into the epicenter of Dr. Elias Thorne's illicit pharmaceutical empire, entirely unarmed. A king willingly surrendering his crown to save the life of a child who was not even his own. He parked the vehicle near the center of the yard, stepping out into the freezing deluge. He raised his hands, showing his empty palms to the shadows. Almost immediately, a dozen high-powered tactical flashlights clicked on from the upper catwalks and container roofs, blinding him. Heavily armed mercenaries descended from the steel structures, their assault rifles raised and perfectly trained on Jude's chest. They stripped him of his coat, patted him down with brutal efficiency, and bound his wrists behind his back with heavy industrial zip ties. Jude did not resist. His face was an impenetrable mask of cold, dead calm. He had made his peace with the devil's bargain. Deep beneath the shipyard, hidden inside a retrofitted submarine bunker, lay Thorne's primary manufacturing laboratory. It was a massive, sterile expanse of gleaming stainless steel, automated chemical synthesizers, and pressurized clean rooms where millions of dollars of illicit synthetic opioids were processed daily. Thorne stood at the center of the main floor, wearing a pristine white laboratory coat over his expensive suit, a triumphant, sociopathic smile curving his lips. He held a small, silver-reinforced case in his gloved hands. As Jude was violently shoved into the brightly lit room by the mercenaries, forced to his knees on the polished floor, Thorne let out a dry, aristocratic laugh that echoed off the metal walls. "I must admit, Julian, I never believed you actually possessed a conscience," Thorne mocked, slowly pacing around Jude like a predator circling a wounded animal. The great, terrifying Julian Sterling, the apex predator of Hadley, brought to his knees not by a rival cartel, not by the federal government, but by the pathetic, weeping sentimentality of a penniless nurse. "You have traded an empire of billions for a single vial of chemicals." Thorne snapped the silver case open, revealing a small, glass vial filled with a glowing, amber liquid. The antidote, a masterpiece of molecular engineering. It is truly a tragedy that you will not live to see it administered, miles away. In the subterranean clinic beneath the penthouse, Clara Vance was living her own nightmare. Lily lay motionless on the steel trauma table, a mechanical ventilator rhythmically forcing oxygen into her failing lungs. The black blood had stopped bubbling from her lips, but her skin was entirely translucent, the digital monitor displaying a horrifyingly weak and erratic cardiac rhythm. Clara stood over her, her hands gripping the steel rails of the bed. Bruno stood in the corner, his massive arms crossed, his scarred face tight with an agonizing sense of helplessness. Jude had ordered him to stay, to wait for the call to retrieve the antidote from the shipyard gates. But Clara knew the truth. She had seen the pure, unadulterated hatred in Thorne's eyes. She knew the psychology of a narcissist who had just been humiliated. Thorne had no intention of honoring the trade. He was going to execute Jude the moment he had him in his custody. And he was going to destroy the antidote just to ensure Clara suffered for the rest of her life. The realization snapped something fundamental inside Clara's mind. The weeping, helpless trauma nurse vanished. In her place emerged a woman forged in the fires of survival. A woman who refused to let the two people she loved most die in the dark. "Bruno," Clara said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute calm that commanded the room. She turned to face the towering head of security, her eyes burning with a fierce, uncompromising fire. "Jude is walking into an execution. Thorne is not going to hand over that vial." He is going to kill Julian. And then he is going to let Lily die. You know this. Your tactical instincts know this. Bruno uncrossed his arms, his jaw clenching. He knew she was right, but he was bound by Julian's direct orders. My orders are to secure the perimeter and wait for the handoff. Ms. Vance, Bruno rumbled, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. Clara stepped forward, closing the distance between them. I am countermanding that order. I am the chief medical officer of this facility, and I am telling you that if we wait, we lose them both. We are going to the shipyard. Leave the medical team to monitor the ventilator. You are going to get me inside that laboratory. 10 minutes later, Clara and a heavily armed tactical squad, led by Bruno, breached the outer perimeter of the shipyard, while Bruno and his men engaged Thorne's outer security forces in a brutal, coordinated firefight among the cargo containers. Clara slipped through a secondary ventilation access shaft she had identified on the structural blueprints Jude kept in his study. She dropped into the sterile hallways of the underground laboratory, moving like a phantom in her dark scrubs. She didn't have a weapon, but she possessed something far more dangerous in a chemical manufacturing plant: a brilliant, intimate knowledge of complex medical technology. She bypassed the outer security doors, slipping into the main environmental control room overlooking the manufacturing floor. Through the reinforced glass, she saw Jude kneeling on the floor, surrounded by armed guards, with Thorne standing over him, holding a heavy pistol to his head. You built your kingdom on violence, Julian, Thorne sneered, pulling the hammer back on the handgun. And so it ends in violence. Goodbye, Mr. Sterling. Clara didn't scream. She didn't hit the glass. She spun around to the main environmental control console. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the basic security protocols using universal override codes she had learned during her years dealing with hazardous material lockdowns in the hospital. She targeted the laboratory's emergency chemical sterilization protocol, a failsafe designed to flood the clean rooms with highly corrosive, incinerating gas in the event of a catastrophic biological leak. But she didn't just target the clean rooms. She linked the protocol to every single manufacturing vat, every storage silo, and every ventilation duct in Thorne's illicit empire. She initiated the sequence, locking the blast doors of the manufacturing floor to trap Thorne and his men inside, and smashed her fist down on the execution key. Sirens immediately shrieked through the subterranean facility, bathing the laboratory in flashing, apocalyptic red light. Automated blast shields slammed down over the exits. The massive steel vats of synthetic opioids began to violently vent high-pressure sterilization foam, instantly destroying hundreds of millions of dollars of illicit narcotics. The sudden, chaotic eruption of hissing gas and blaring alarms completely shattered Thorne's focus. He stumbled backward, dropping the pistol in sheer panic as he watched his entire life's work, his indestructible empire of poison, dissolve into worthless, foaming sludge right before his eyes. The mercenaries, realizing they were trapped in a rapidly deteriorating chemical environment, broke ranks, desperately hammering against the locked blast doors. In the chaos, Jude moved. The zip ties binding his wrists were heavy industrial plastic, but he had spent the last 10 minutes secretly grinding the locking mechanism against a sharp, exposed screw on the floor grate. With a violent, agonizing twist that tore the skin from his wrists, he snapped the ties. He surged upward like a coiled spring, tackling the nearest mercenary and stripping the assault rifle from his hands in one fluid, brutal motion. A desperate, close-quarters firefight erupted in the center of the foaming laboratory. Jude moved with lethal, terrifying precision, dropping the remaining guards as he fought his way through the blinding chemical smoke toward Thorne. Thorne, screaming in pure, unhinged fury, scrambled across the floor to retrieve his dropped pistol. He grabbed the silver case containing the antidote, his eyes locking onto Jude through the haze. You ruined me, Thorne shrieked, raising the weapon. He didn't aim for Jude's head. He aimed center mass, pulling the trigger just as Jude lunged forward. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. The heavy caliber bullet struck Jude point-blank in the chest, the kinetic force violently stopping his forward momentum and throwing him backward onto the steel floor. Blood instantly bloomed across his shirt, a dark, fatal stain spreading rapidly. But even as his lungs filled with blood, even as the catastrophic trauma shut down his nervous system, Jude's hand shot out. He grabbed Thorne's ankle, pulling the doctor down to the floor, and ripped the silver case from his grasp. Jude lay on his back, gasping for air, clutching the vial of the antidote to his bleeding chest as if it were the most sacred relic in the universe. The blast doors of the laboratory suddenly blew open, the heavy steel warped by specialized breaching charges. Bruno and his tactical team flooded the room, immediately securing Thorne and the surviving mercenaries. Clara sprinted through the smoke, her heart shattering into a million jagged pieces as she saw Jude lying in an expanding pool of his own blood. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands frantically pressing against the massive exit wound in his back and the entry wound in his chest. Jude, Jude. Look at me, Clara screamed, tears streaming down her face as she tried to apply pressure. Jude's eyes were glassy, his skin turning an ashen, terrifying gray. He didn't look at his wound. He weakly lifted his blood-soaked hand, pressing the silver case into Clara's trembling palm. "Take it," he whispered, his voice a wet, ragged rattle. "Save her, Clara. Save our girl." Bruno stood over them, his weapon trained directly on Thorne, who was laughing hysterically from the floor. "He's dead, nurse," Thorne spat, blood dripping from his own bruised face. The bullet shattered his aorta. "You won the battle, but you lost the war." Jude's head lolled to the side, his breathing stopping entirely. The fierce, indomitable light in his dark eyes flickered and went out. His heart, the heart that had finally found peace to the rhythm of a metronome, fell completely, terrifyingly silent. Clara stared at his motionless face, a scream of absolute, world-ending agony tearing from her throat. She had the antidote in her hand, but the man who had bought it with his life was gone. She looked up at Thorne, the laughing monster who had orchestrated this entire tragedy. A dark, vengeful fury, cold and absolute, rose in Clara's chest. She stood up, her scrubs soaked in Jude's blood, and walked over to Bruno. She reached out, wrapping her hand around the barrel of Bruno's heavy assault rifle, silently asking for the weapon. She wanted to pull the trigger. She wanted to erase Elias Thorne from the surface of the earth. But as her finger brushed the cold steel of the gun, she looked down at the silver case in her hand. She thought of Lily. She thought of the oath she had taken as a healer, the vow to protect human life, no matter how corrupted it was. She thought of what she had told Jude in the rain, that they do not become the monsters they are fighting. If she pulled this trigger, she would be validating Thorne's worldview. She would be proving that violence was the only ultimate authority. Clara slowly pushed the barrel of Bruno's rifle down toward the floor. She looked Thorne dead in the eye, her voice a chilling, absolute whisper that cut through the alarms. "Your empire is ash. Your money is gone. And I just anonymously transmitted every single encrypted file from your servers directly to the FBI, the DEA, and the national press. You are not going to die a martyr in the dark. Elias, you are going to be dragged into the light. You are going to stand in a courtroom, stripped of your power, and you are going to spend the rest of your miserable life locked in a concrete box, entirely forgotten." She turned away from the shattered doctor, dismissing him entirely. She ran back to Jude's lifeless body, slamming her hands against his bloody chest. "Bruno, take the antidote. Take the tactical chopper on the roof and get this vial to the clinic right now," Clara ordered, her voice echoing with the fierce, undeniable authority of a woman declaring war on death itself. "Do not wait for me. Save Lily." As Bruno snatched the case and sprinted for the exit, Clara straddled Jude's motionless body, interlacing her fingers and preparing to perform the most desperate, impossible resuscitation of her life. The chaotic wail of the laboratory sirens faded into a distant, muffled hum in Clara's mind. entirely eclipsed by the singular, terrifying reality of the moment. Julian Sterling was clinically dead. His heart had stopped beating. The bullet had caused massive trauma to his chest cavity, and conventional medical wisdom dictated that field resuscitation without a surgical team, a massive blood transfusion, an immediate operative intervention was a futile, heartbreaking waste of energy. But Clara Vance was not operating on conventional wisdom. She was operating on a fierce, uncompromising love that refused to surrender to the dark. She ripped Jude's blood-soaked shirt open, exposing his broad, scarred chest. She positioned the heel of her hand directly over his sternum, locked her elbows, and threw her entire body weight into the first compression. The sickening crack of his ribs giving way echoed in the empty space. A necessary brutality to manually force the remaining blood through his stationary heart. She pumped his chest with frantic, aggressive precision. 1, 2, 3, 4. She leaned down, pinching his nose, and forced a breath of air into his lungs, ignoring the multiplicated blood on her lips. "Don't you dare leave me, Julian Sterling," Clara sobbed, her tears mixing with the blood on his chest as she resumed the compressions. "You promised me. You promised me you would choose the light. You don't get to die in the dark. Come back to me." She needed a rhythm. The panic was making her compressions erratic, too fast to allow the chambers of his heart to properly fill with blood. She reached into her pocket with a trembling, blood-slicked hand and pulled out her cell phone. Her fingers slipped across the screen, leaving smeared red fingerprints on the glass, until she managed to open the metronome application. She didn't set it to the frantic 150 beats per minute she had used as an SOS. She didn't set it to the slow, calming 60 beats per minute that he used to sleep. She set the digital dial to exactly 100 beats per minute, the perfect, clinical, life-saving tempo for cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Tick, 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 tick. The mechanical sound cut through the heavy, oppressive silence of the ruined laboratory. It was the sound that had first bound their souls together in the alleyway. It was the anchor that had pulled him out of his nightmares. And now, it was the rhythm Clara used to literally beat life back into his shattered body. She synchronized her compressions perfectly to the metronome, pushing down hard and fast, forcing his heart to pump, forcing his brain to receive oxygen. Minutes dragged on like hours. Her arms burned with lactic acid, her own fractured ribs screaming in excruciating agony with every downward thrust. But she absolutely refused to stop. She was a healer, and this man was her heart. "Breathe, Jude. Fight," she screamed, her voice hoarse and ragged. 5 minutes passed. The statistical probability of reviving a trauma arrest in the field was practically zero. Claire's strength was fading, her vision blurring at the edges as exhaustion threatened to pull her under. But the metronome kept ticking, an unwavering, mechanical heartbeat refusing to accept defeat. On the 7th minute, just as Clara's arms began to buckle, a miraculous, violent shudder ripped through Jude's massive frame. His back arched off the steel floor, a sudden ragged gasp tearing from his throat. He coughed violently, expelling a spray of blood from his lungs, his eyes flying open in sheer, terrified shock. The heart that had stopped beating suddenly kicked back into a rapid, thready but undeniably real rhythm. Clara collapsed onto his chest, weeping hysterically, her hands gently framing his pale face. "You're here," she sobbed, pressing her forehead against his, feeling the weak, erratic breath escaping his lips. "You're still here." Jude could not speak. The pain was absolute, his vision swimming in a haze of agony. But he felt the warmth of her tears on his skin, and he heard the steady, faithful ticking of the metronome beside his head. He weakly lifted his hand, his fingers tangling in her dark hair, a silent, profound vow that he was never letting go again. Within minutes, a secondary medical extraction team organized by Bruno swarmed the laboratory, loading Jude onto a portable stretcher and rushing him to a waiting medevac helicopter. Clara never left his side, her hand tightly gripping his as they lifted off into the stormy night sky, leaving the ashes of Elias Thorne's empire far behind them. 3 weeks later, The storm had finally broken, giving way to a brilliant, crisp autumn morning. The city of Hadley was irrevocably changed. Dr. Elias Thorne was residing in a maximum security federal holding facility, denied bail, awaiting trial for a staggering list of federal indictments ranging from domestic terrorism to illegal human experimentation. The vast, illicit network he had built had been completely dismantled by the authorities. The evidence Clara had anonymously provided serving as the undeniable cornerstone of his prosecution. But Thorne was not the only kingpin to fall. Julian Sterling had kept his promise. Sitting in his hospital bed in the underground clinic, slowly recovering from the catastrophic chest wound that had nearly claimed his life, Jude had made a series of encrypted phone calls. He did not pass his empire to another lieutenant. He systematically dismantled it. He dissolved the violent enforcement wings, severed ties with the corrupt port authorities, and liquidated billions of dollars of illicit assets, laundering the money one final time through a complex web of shell companies until it emerged completely clean. He was no longer the apex predator of the underworld. He had laid down his sword, choosing to walk into the light. Clara stood in the center of the newly renovated administrative wing of what used to be Jude's fortress-like penthouse. The ballistic glass and heavy reinforced steel remained, but the cold, sterile atmosphere had been entirely replaced by warmth, sunlight, and purpose. The space had been converted into the operational headquarters of the Daniel Sterling Medical Foundation, a massively funded, legitimate philanthropic organization dedicated to providing free, state-of-the-art healthcare, rehabilitation, and advocacy for the homeless and marginalized populations of the East Coast. Clara had been named the chief director of the foundation. She was no longer a penniless, blacklisted nurse. She was the architect of a medical revolution, using the wealth generated from the dark to bring healing to those who needed it most. The heavy oak doors of her new office opened, and Jude walked in. He moved a bit slower than before. A slight stiffness in his chest, a lingering reminder of the bullet he had taken. But he looked healthier and more vibrant than Clara had ever seen him. The dark, haunted shadows that had plagued his eyes for years were entirely gone. He was wearing a tailored navy suit, looking every bit the legitimate, powerful philanthropist he had chosen to become. The board of directors just approved the funding for the 3 new community clinics in the lower wards, Jude said, walking over to her desk. A warm, genuine smile played on his lips. It seems your initiative to provide unconditional medical access is going to be fully operational by next month. Director Vance, Clara smiled, stepping out from behind the desk to wrap her arms gently around his waist, resting her head carefully against his chest. She listened to the strong, steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It wouldn't be possible without the mysterious, anonymous donor who funded the foundation, she teased softly, looking up into his dark eyes. Jude wrapped his arms around her shoulders, pulling her close, burying his face in her hair. The donor was just a man who finally realized that true power isn't found in a gun or a ledger. It's found in the hands that heal. He kissed the top of her head, a gesture of profound, enduring devotion. Speaking of healing, there is someone waiting for us in the garden. They walked together out to the expansive, sunlit rooftop terrace of the penthouse. The garden was a lush oasis of green ivy, vibrant autumn flowers, and manicured lawns, a stark contrast to the concrete jungle below. Sitting on a wooden bench, swinging her legs and drawing with a set of colored pencils, was Lily. The little girl was the picture of perfect health. The antidote had worked flawlessly, reversing the necrosis and clearing the toxins from her system before any permanent damage could take root. She looked up, her face breaking into a radiant, missing-tooth smile as she saw Clara and Jude approaching. Uncle Jude, Auntie Clara, look, I drew a picture of our new house. Lily cheered, holding up a piece of sketch paper. Jude sat down next to her on the bench, inspecting the drawing with absolute, serious attention, while Clara sat on his other side, leaning her head on his shoulder. They were a family, forged in the crucible of absolute terror and violence. They had emerged whole, bound together by a love that had literally conquered death. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the Hadley skyline, painting the horizon in hues of gold and amber, Clara and Jude lay together in the massive bed of the master suite. The air was quiet, peaceful, and entirely devoid of fear. Clara reached over to the nightstand to turn off the reading lamp. Her hand brushed against her cell phone, resting quietly on the polished wood. The metronome app was closed. Jude didn't need the mechanical ticking to keep the nightmares at bay anymore. The ghosts of his past had finally been laid to rest, and the silence of the dark was no longer a terrifying void. He pulled Clara into his arms, resting his cheek against her forehead as he closed his eyes, his breathing slowing into a deep, peaceful rhythm. He didn't need a metronome, because the only rhythm he needed to anchor his soul was the steady, faithful heartbeat of the woman sleeping right beside him, the woman who had walked into the rain, faced down the devil, and never left again. As the dust settles on the ruins of Dr. Elias Thorne's illicit empire, and the frantic ticking of the metronome finally fades into a peaceful, enduring silence, the story of Clara Vance and Julian Sterling leaves us with a profound resonance that extends far beyond the dangerous shadows of Hadley's underworld. At its very core, this is not merely a tale of a mafia boss and a trauma nurse. It is a deep exploration of human dignity, the devastating weight of trauma, and the miraculous, redemptive power of unwavering compassion. Throughout their harrowing journey, we are forced to confront the true definition of power. Society often dictates that power looks like wealth, absolute control, and the ability to instill fear everything that Thorne and the old Julian Sterling represented. But Clara, a woman stripped of her career, her home, and her reputation, proved that the ultimate, indestructible power lies in the hands that heal. She walked into a fortress of killers, armed with nothing but her absolute moral clarity, explicitly reminding us that a heartbeat does not check a bank account before it stops. Every single human life holds the exact same weight and deserves the exact same dignity, whether they are a forgotten patient on the street or the most feared syndicate boss in the city. The recurring motif of the metronome serves as the emotional anchor of this narrative, symbolizing the profound necessity of human connection and the promise of presence. For 3 agonizing years, Julian was trapped in a self-imposed prison of guilt, grief, and insomnia, convinced that the darkness would eventually consume him. No amount of money or military might could cure the shattered fragments of his soul. What healed him was not a complex pharmaceutical drug, but the simple, steadfast presence of a woman who refused to let him drown. Clara did not just patch up his physical wounds, she sat beside him in his darkest hours, proving that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply choosing to stay when everyone else has run away. Her steady, unyielding rhythm reminded him that he was still alive, and more importantly, that his life was still worth saving. It is a powerful reminder to all of us that in our own lives, we possess the incredible ability to be that steady rhythm for someone else. We may not be fighting cartel bosses, but we all know someone battling invisible demons, and sometimes, all they need is for us to sit beside them in the dark, hold their hand, and promise them that morning will eventually come. Furthermore, the climax of this story delivers a crucial, resounding lesson about breaking the cycle of violence and maintaining one's humanity in the face of absolute evil. When Julian had the opportunity to execute the corrupt police captain in the street, and when Clara had the chance to shoot Thorne in the ruined laboratory, they both chose restraint. Clara's desperate plea that we must never become the monsters we are fighting is the ultimate triumph of the human spirit. Justice requires integrity, not slaughter. By choosing to let the law handle Thorne, and by Julian choosing to completely dismantle his violent empire to build a foundation of healing. They broke the chains of trauma and vengeance. They proved that no matter how deep into the darkness you have walked, it is never too late to turn around, lay down your weapons, and step into the light. True redemption is always a choice, earned through sacrifice and the courage to change. Ultimately, Clara and Julian's journey teaches us that true safety is not found behind ballistic glass, inside locked vaults, or surrounded by an army of guards. True safety is found within a heart that loves you enough to fight for your soul when you have given up on yourself. It challenges us to treat every person we meet with fundamental respect, to stand up courageously against systemic cruelty, and to remember that kindness, no matter how small it may seem, can literally restart a dying heart. This content was researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful value and profound life lessons. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below, so we can continue bringing you tales that inspire, uplift, and heal.